She had 3 days to pack her entire life into a single trunk, and no say in who she'd spend the rest of it with. At 20 years old, Clara Ashford stood in her father's kitchen while a stranger's name was handed to her like a sentence. Silas Boone, a trapper. A man nobody in Dunmore settlement could say much about, except that he'd survived winters that killed everyone else. That was supposed to be enough. That was supposed to be a gift. The mountain pass would seal in less than 2 weeks. Her father was dying by inches, and he knew it. And so he made his decision the way desperate men always do, fast, clean, without asking the person it would cost the most. Clara didn't cry. She packed her trunk, and she decided quietly that whatever came next, she would face it with her eyes wide open. Like the channel. Comment your city. Let me know how far this story has traveled. The morning her father told her, Clara was elbow deep in bread dough. It was the kind of gray October morning that came down off the Rockies like a threat. The sky the color of old iron, the wind already carrying that particular bite that said snow is coming and it isn't coming soft. Clara had been up since before light, banking the kitchen stove, hauling in wood from the pile beside the barn, starting the bread because if she didn't start it before 6, it wouldn't rise properly in the cold. She knew the rhythm of this house the way she knew her own heartbeat. She had kept it running for 4 years since her mother passed, and she'd learned to find something close to satisfaction in the doing of it, even when she was the only one who noticed. Her father, Edmund Ashford, came in from the back just after sunrise. He was moving slower than he had a month ago. She noticed that too, though she didn't say it. His left hand shook when he poured his coffee, and he sat down at the table with the careful weight of a man whose body was becoming unreliable. "Clara," he said, "sit down. The dough needs another turn." "It'll keep." She looked at him then. Really looked. The color of his face, the way he held his cup with both hands to hide the tremor. She wiped her hands on her apron and sat. He told her plainly. That was one thing about Edmund Ashford. He'd never been a man to dress things up. He'd arranged a marriage. The man's name was Silas Boone. He trapped the upper ridges, had a claim on a solid piece of land 2 miles north of the settlement, and had a cabin that would hold heat through February, which was more than Edmund could say for his own place anymore. The ceremony would happen in 4 days, before the pass closed. Clara sat very still. "You didn't ask me," she said. "No." "You didn't?" She stopped, pressed her floury hands flat against the table. "Papa, I'm 20 years old. I'm not a... This isn't something you do to a person." "I know it." He looked down at his coffee. "I know what this looks like, Clara girl. I'm not asking you to think well of me for it." "Then why?" He was quiet long enough that she thought he might not answer. Then, "Because I'm not going to make it to spring. And I will not leave you alone in this valley, with no protection and no claim, and no man willing to stand between you and whatever comes next." He raised his eyes to hers, and what she saw in them wasn't cruelty. It was fear. Pure, quiet, fatherly fear. And that almost made it worse. "Silas Boone is a good man. I've watched him 3 seasons. He doesn't drink. He doesn't boast. He's never said a dishonest word that I've heard. And believe me, I've listened. He's a stranger." "Most husbands are at the beginning," Clara pushed back from the table. She didn't slam anything. She didn't shout. She went back to the dough and she worked it harder than it needed, pressing her knuckles in until her arms ached, and she didn't speak again for the rest of the morning. She'd seen Silas Boone exactly twice before. The first time was at the late summer trading post, when he came in off the trail with a load of pelts and bought supplies with the efficient manner of a man who knew exactly what he needed and didn't want to spend more time in town than necessary. He was tall, not in the showy way some men were tall, but in a way that seemed structural, like he'd been built for the kind of work that broke other men down. Dark hair, a few weeks past a cut, weathered skin, a jaw that looked like it had been set by someone who didn't believe in softness. He hadn't spoken more than a dozen words the entire time he was there. The second time was at the Harmon family's harvest gathering, and even there, in a room full of people and noise and children running underfoot, he'd stood near the wall with a cup of cider and watched everything with those quiet, measuring eyes, like he was doing arithmetic on people, and the numbers usually came out the same. Claire had thought, both times, there is something going on inside that man that he has decided nobody gets to see. She hadn't thought much beyond that, You didn't think beyond that about a man you had no business thinking about. Now she was supposed to marry him in 4 days. She spent those 4 days in a particular kind of fury that had nowhere to go. She cleaned things that didn't need cleaning. She reorganized the pantry shelves twice. She went for long walks in the pale afternoon light and came back with her cheeks raw from wind and her mind no quieter than when she left. Martha Hale from 2 doors over came by the second day and patted Clara's hand and said, "Well, at least he has good land." And Clara smiled until Martha left and then stood at the window for a long time looking at the mountains. On the third day, Silas Boone came to the house. She heard the knock and beat her father to the door, partly because Edmund was slow getting up now, and partly because she wanted to see this man properly, on her terms, before anything was settled between them. He stood on the porch with his hat in his hands. That was the first thing she noticed. He'd taken it off before she even opened the door, which meant he'd had it off before he knocked, which meant he'd stood out there and made a deliberate decision about it. Some men would call that manners. Clara called it information. "Miss Ashford," he said. His voice was lower than she'd expected, even. "Mr. Boone." A silence. He looked at her with those dark eyes, and she looked back, and neither of them pretended that this wasn't exactly as awkward as it was. "I know this isn't what you'd have chosen," he said. She almost laughed. "No. I want you to know I'm not." He stopped, started again. "I told your father it should be your decision." He felt differently about the timing. She stared at him. "You told him that?" "Yes." His jaw tightened slightly, like the words cost something. "I told him twice." She didn't know what to do with that. She stood in the doorway holding the edge of the frame, and she studied him. The honest set of his shoulders, the way he didn't try to fill the silence with something easier. And she thought, well, that's something. She stepped back and let him in. The conversation she had with her father that night was quieter and worse than any fight they'd ever had. "He told you it should be my choice," she said. Edmund was in his chair by the stove, wrapped in the quilt her mother had made. "He did." "And you still—" "Clara." He looked at her with exhausted eyes. "I am a dying man who loves his daughter and is terrified of what happens to her when he's gone. That's the whole truth of it. You can be angry at me for it. You can be angry at me forever if you want. But I need you to be safe, and Silas Boone is the best chance you have of that." She sat down across from him. "If he's such an honest man," she said, "why didn't he refuse? If he believed it should be my choice, why did he agree to this?" Edmund was quiet. "Papa." "He said—" Her father rubbed his face with one shaking hand. "He said he thought you were worth knowing. That's how he put it, worth knowing, and that he figured he'd rather be there than not, even if you came to hate him for it." Clara said nothing. She went to bed without speaking again, and she lay on her back in the dark and stared at the ceiling and thought about a man who had told her father no and still shown up anyway because he thought she was worth knowing. She didn't know what to do with that either. The wedding was held on a cold Thursday morning in the settlement's meeting house, which was used for gatherings and disputes and occasionally ceremonies, depending on what the season required. There were maybe 30 people there, not because anyone had invited them specifically, but because word traveled fast in a settlement that size, and people liked to see things happen. Clara wore her mother's blue dress, taken in at the waist because her mother had been built differently. She'd done the alterations herself at 2 a.m. because her hands had needed something to do. The dress fit well enough. She pinned her hair up and looked at herself in the small mirror above her washstand and thought, "You're still you. Whatever else happens, that part doesn't change." Silas was already there when she arrived. He was standing near the front of the room in a clean dark coat that looked like he'd borrowed it or bought it recently. It fit him oddly across the shoulders, a little too broad, and she found that more reassuring than a perfect fit would have been somehow. His hair was combed. He looked the way people look when they're trying to do right by an occasion that makes them uncomfortable. When she walked in, he watched her come down the center of the room, and his expression didn't do anything theatrical. He didn't smile the wide, nervous smile of a man performing. He just looked at her steadily, like he was taking note of something, and gave her a small nod that said, "I see you. I'm here. Whatever you need from this." She nodded back. The Justice of the Peace, old Warren Caulfield, who also served as the settlement's postmaster and occasional arbitrator, read through the words in a businesslike way that Clara appreciated. No flourishes, no lingering on the parts that were supposed to feel sacred, just the plain shape of a legal agreement, which was, Clara thought, the honest way to treat what this was. When Warren got to the part about consent, Silas turned to her very slightly. Not much, just enough that she knew. This is still your call. Yes, she said. Silas said it too, and his voice didn't waver. Warren pronounced them married, and there was a small round of applause from the people gathered. The polite kind that acknowledges an event without committing to enthusiasm. Someone, probably Martha Hale, had brought a small cake. Clara ate a piece of it. It was good. She noticed that Silas didn't take any, though she wasn't sure if that was manners or something else. Her father pressed her hand before they left. His grip was weak, and she felt that weakness like a bruise. "I'll come see you settled," he said. "I know, Papa." She squeezed back. The ride to Silas's cabin took a little over an hour. He drove the wagon and she sat beside him, and neither of them spoke much for the first stretch. The road north of the settlement was barely a road. More of a track, really, pressed into the earth by a season's worth of wagon wheels and horse hooves, and a general agreement that this was where you went if you were going north. The aspens on both sides had already dropped most of their leaves, and the branches made a pale gray lattice against the sky. It was beautiful in a stripped-down way, the way things are beautiful when they've stopped pretending. "You can ask me things," Silas said at one point. "If you have questions." "I have 100 questions." "All right." She looked at him sideways. "Why a trapper?" He considered that seriously, which she appreciated. "My father trapped. I went out with him the first time when I was 8. There's something about it. You learn to read a place, the tracks, the patterns, where the game goes when the season changes. It's—" he paused. "It's honest work. The land tells you what's true." "What about people? What about them? Do people tell you what's true?" His mouth curved slightly. Not a full smile, more like the idea of one. "Less often." She faced forward again. "The cabin," she said. "How long have you been there?" 3 years. Built it the first winter. Lived in it while I was building it, which—" He stopped. "Which what?" "Which I wouldn't recommend," he said flatly. She almost smiled, almost. "There's a bedroom," he said, "and a main room, storeroom off the back. It's not much, but it holds heat." He said that last part with something close to pride, and she understood that heat in a winter cabin was not a small thing. "I'm not expecting much," she said, and then heard how that might sound. "I don't mean that as— I just mean I'm not going to complain about what isn't there." "I know what you meant." She glanced at him again. He was looking at the road ahead, hands easy on the reins, jaw relaxed. Whatever was going on inside him, he kept it someplace quiet. She found herself wondering what it would take to get to that place, and then told herself that was not a thing she needed to be wondering about on her wedding day. The cabin appeared around a bend in the track, set back from the tree line with a small barn to the left and a woodpile that ran nearly the full length of the east wall. Clara looked at the woodpile first and thought, "He prepared." That pile was not the work of last week. That pile had been built up over months, cord after cord, stacked with the kind of precision that meant he'd thought about it and kept thinking. The cabin itself was log, square-built, with a good stone chimney and a porch that ran across the front. There were shutters on the windows that could be closed and barred. She could tell from the hardware. It was modest, solid. It looked like something built to last rather than something built to impress. He unhitched the team and took care of the horses before anything else, and she stood on the porch while he did it and looked out at the mountain ridges going gray in the afternoon light. The air up here was thinner, colder, quieter. The settlement sounds, the distant hammering, the dog that barked at everything, the occasional shout of someone's name across a yard, were entirely gone. There was just the wind and the horses and the particular silence of high country before winter. He came back and unlocked the door and held it for her. She stepped inside. The cabin was plain and clean. A table, 2 chairs, a stove that dominated the main wall, shelves of supplies. A wooden floor, not dirt, which was more than she'd expected. Rugs, rough ones, probably made here, but enough to keep the cold from coming straight up through the boards. A door on the far side of the main room, which she understood was the bedroom. "I'll take the main room," he said behind her. "The bedroom's yours." She turned to look at him. He was standing just inside the doorway, hat in his hand again. "It's your cabin," she said. "It's your home now," he said, simply, as if that settled it. "I've got the bunk beside the stove. I've slept there before when the bedroom got too cold. It's fine." She studied him. The particular quality of a man offering something without wanting credit for it. "All right," she said. "Thank you." He nodded and set his hat on a peg by the door and went to start a fire. The first week was the strangest of Clara's life, and she'd had some strange weeks. She woke the first morning in the bedroom, which had a narrow bed with a good quilt and a small window that looked out at the pine ridge, and lay there listening to the sounds of him already moving in the main room, the stove crackling, the weight of his boots on the floor, the quiet, methodical sounds of a man who knew exactly what he was doing in his own space. She dressed and came out and found coffee made and a plate of biscuits on the table, because apparently Silas Boone could cook at least that much, which was more than she'd expected. He was pulling on his coat to go out. "I'll be on the trap line until midday," he said. "There's flour and salt pork in the storeroom. Help yourself to whatever you need." "What needs doing around here?" He paused, looked at her. "Nothing that can't wait." "That's not what I asked." Something shifted behind his eyes. "Not quite respect. Or maybe it was, but the understated kind. There's a loose shutter on the south window. I've got weather stripping that needs replacing on the door. Storeroom needs reorganizing before the real cold sets in. But none of that is—" "I'll start with the storeroom," she said. He looked at her for another moment, then nodded and went out. She worked all morning. The storeroom was not a mess exactly, but it was the storeroom of a man who lived alone. Practical stacking without system, items put where there was space rather than where they made sense. She reorganized it properly. Dry goods on the upper shelves where moisture wouldn't reach them, the heavier smoked meat lower, the tools hung on the wall where she could see them. She found a small cache of remedies, dried willow bark, a tin of wound salve, something she didn't recognize in a brown paper packet, and noted where they were. When he came back at noon with 2 rabbits and a look of mild surprise at how quiet the cabin felt, she was rehanging the weather stripping on the door herself. He stood in the yard and watched her. "I couldn't get the left side to lay flat," she said, not looking down. "I put a nail here." She tapped the frame. "And that seems to have sorted it. Do you want to check my work?" A pause. "No," he said. "I trust it." She climbed down and they had a lunch of yesterday's bread and salted venison, and they didn't talk much, but it wasn't an uncomfortable silence. It was the silence of 2 people learning the rhythm of the same space. So, the trouble with not talking about something, Clara was learning, was that it kept getting louder. By the end of the first week, she knew. He rose before she did, made the fire and often the coffee, went out on his lines, came back by early afternoon, worked until dark on the 100 small tasks that a cabin and a claim required. He fixed the shutter she'd pointed out and the 3 others she hadn't yet mentioned. He patched a section of barn roof in the rain, which she saw through the window and noted without comment. He ate what she cooked without complaint. And she was a good cook. Her mother had taught her right, and thanked her for it every single time, a simple direct thank you that didn't perform gratitude but expressed it. He didn't push into her space, didn't hover, didn't ask questions about her feelings or her adjustment or whether she was happy, which she found she appreciated more than any amount of gentle inquiries would have earned. He just kept showing up, kept doing things, kept being exactly what his actions said he was. One night, near the end of that first week, she sat at the table after dinner with a piece of mending, and he sat across from her sharpening his knives, the slow, careful drag of steel against stone. And she said, without planning to, "How long did you know my father before he asked you about this?" He didn't look up from the stone. "About 2 years?" "Did he bring it up, or did you?" "He brought it up last summer." The stone dragged. "I told him I wasn't interested in an arrangement." "And then?" "And then he came back in September and told me the pass would close soon, and he wasn't going to survive another winter, and he needed to know you'd be taken care of." He set down the knife and looked at her across the table. He cried. "Your father," sitting there in the trading post in front of 3 other men. And he didn't care who saw. He cried, and he asked me. Claire's throat tightened. She kept her eyes on her mending. I said I'd do it if you agreed, Silas said. He said he'd make sure you agreed, and I said I didn't want that. I wanted it to be a real choice. And he said there wasn't time for all that. He picked up the knife again. I should have held to my position. Why didn't you? The stone dragged again, slow and even. Because he wasn't wrong that you needed someone, Silas said, and I figured I'd rather it be me than whoever else might have stepped forward. Why you? He looked up. Because I knew I'd treat you right, he said. Like it was simple. Like it wasn't the most direct thing anyone had said to her in years. She looked down at the mending. She put in 3 careful stitches. The fire in the stove ticked and the wind moved against the shutters. All right, she said finally. He went back to his stone. October became November, and the cold descended like a hand pressing down. Clara had grown up in this valley, and she knew winters, but there was something about being in the higher elevation with the ridges on 3 sides that changed the scale of everything. The snow came first as flurries, then as sustained, serious falls that left the world white and quiet and strange. The track down to the settlement disappeared. The barn took on a layer of ice along the north wall that Silas knocked off methodically every 3 days. She started going with him to do the evening chores. She hadn't asked, just put on her coat and boots one afternoon and came out, and he looked at her and she looked back and they went together and that was that. She learned to move around the horses the way he did. Calm, deliberate, no sudden moves. He showed her the trick with the barn latch that froze in deep cold, and how to check the water trough for ice without getting your sleeves soaked, and where he kept the extra lamp oil in case they lost the lantern in a storm. He never talked down to her, showed her things once and assumed she'd gotten it. She had a system for the kitchen that was different from anything he'd been doing, and he adjusted to it without argument or comment, just absorbed it, started doing things her way when she wasn't looking, which she discovered one morning when she came in and found the bread pans stacked in the precise order she'd put them in 2 days ago. One afternoon in early November, she found him on the porch, rewrapping the handle of an axe she'd mentioned. Once, in passing, not as a complaint, was getting loose. He was working the rawhide in careful overlapping layers, his breath coming out in white clouds, and she stood in the doorway and watched him for a minute and thought, he listens. He actually listens. That was the first crack. The news from the settlement came when it could, which was not often. Occasionally a neighbor on the north road would come through, or Silas would make the 2-mile trip down and back in the late afternoon. He went one Thursday in early November and came back quieter than usual. She was in the kitchen. What happened? He hung his coat. Your father's roof is leaking, front corner. He's put a bucket under it, but with the snow load coming, he's going to lose that corner by January. She felt the familiar tightening. He didn't tell me. He wouldn't. Can it be fixed? I'm going Saturday, Silas said. Need a full day to do it right, but I can patch it well enough to last the winter. She looked at him. That's 2 miles there and 2 back. On a Saturday. I know the distance, Clara. I just mean, she didn't know what she meant exactly. Thank you. He's your father, Silas said, as if that explained it completely. And she supposed it did. And she supposed it said something about him that he thought it explained itself. He came back Saturday evening cold to the bone, and she had soup waiting, and he didn't say much about the roof, except that it would hold. She put her hand on his arm when she set the bowl down. Just briefly, a second, and he went still, and then she took her hand back and they ate their soup and didn't speak about it. But she noticed he sat a little closer than usual, and she didn't move away. The days shortened until evening came at 4 o'clock, and they spent their nights by lamplight, reading or mending or sitting in the particular comfortable silence that had become their default. She'd found his small collection of books on the shelf above the storeroom door. Nothing grand, mostly practical. A surveyor's almanac, a natural history of the Rockies, 2 works of fiction that looked red-hard. She borrowed one of the novels without asking. He didn't mention it. She found a small piece of paper tucked between the pages. Written in his handwriting, angular, precise, was a single line. The mountain does not change. What changes is what you bring to it. She put the paper back exactly where she'd found it. She didn't ask him about it, but she thought about it for days. That said, one night in mid-November there was a knock at the door at what had to be 9 o'clock. Clara startled from her book, and Silas was already on his feet. He opened the door, and there was young Tom Garrett from the South Claim, 16 years old and white-faced, snow-crusted from a hard ride. "Mr. Boone, my mother." He was trying to catch his breath. "The baby's coming early and something's wrong. She's asking for Mrs. Boone," she heard. "Get inside," Silas said, and to Clara, already reaching for her coat, "You don't have to." "I've helped at birthings before," she said. "Get the wagon." They made it to the Garrett claim in 20 minutes, Silas driving the horses hard on the snow-packed road. Inside, in the back bedroom, Mary Garrett was white and frightened, and the midwife from the settlement hadn't been able to get through because of a drift on the lower road. There was a neighbor woman there who'd delivered calves, but not people. Clara took one look at the situation and said, "All right, here's what we're going to do." She'd been at 3 birthings in her life, all with her mother guiding. She was not a midwife. She told Mary Garrett that plainly. "I'm not a midwife, but I'm here, and I'm steady, and we're going to do this together." Which was the honest thing, and also, it turned out exactly what Mary Garrett needed to hear. The baby came at midnight, small but breathing, furious about it. Clara wrapped him and put him in his mother's arms and stepped back on legs that had gone unsteady without her noticing. Silas was in the front room, sitting with Tom Garrett, who had been very adult about the whole thing and had only cried once, quietly, when the baby started screaming. Silas had said nothing about the crying, just sat there, which Clara thought was exactly right. On the ride home, she was very quiet, and he let her be quiet. And at some point on the dark road, she leaned sideways slightly until her shoulder was against his arm, and neither of them moved for the rest of the drive. But she did not know exactly when she stopped measuring him against her expectations and started just seeing him. There was no single moment she could name. It was more like the way the light changed in the evenings, gradual, and then suddenly you looked up and it was different from what it had been, and you couldn't say which minute had made the difference. She caught herself watching him sometimes. The way he moved through the world with such deliberate economy, nothing wasted, nothing performed. The way he looked at things, horses, sky, broken fence, difficult problem, with the same steady attention, like everything deserved to be taken seriously. The way he almost smiled when something amused him, and then seemed to decide against it, like smiling was something he wasn't sure he'd earned the right to yet. She caught herself thinking, there are things in this man I have not found in the bottom of yet. And then she thought, that's a problem. That's a real problem. Because she hadn't come into this wanting to find anything. She'd come in with her walls built high and her eyes open in her plan to simply endure. And somewhere between the axe handle and the midnight baby and the soup and the paper with the single handwritten line, the plan had started coming apart at the seams. She was sitting with that one evening near the end of November, working on a letter to her father that she'd started 4 times, when Silas came in from outside and stopped when he saw her face. "What's wrong?" he said. She looked up. "Nothing." He looked at her for a long moment with those dark, measuring eyes. "Clara," he said, "you're a terrible liar." She almost said, "Go away." She almost said, "It's none of your business." She said, "I'm writing to my father, and I don't know what to say to him." He sat down across from her. "What do you want to say?" "I want to say—" She stopped, restarted. "I want to say that I'm not angry at him anymore, but I'm afraid if I say that, he'll think it means something it doesn't." "What doesn't it mean?" She met his eyes. The fire was warm. Outside, the wind was picking up. "I don't know yet," she said, honestly. He nodded slowly. The way he nodded when he was accepting something without requiring it to be more than it was. "Then say that," he said. "Say you're not angry. Say the rest when you know it." She picked up her pen. She didn't say anything else, and neither did he, and the fire ticked and the wind built outside, and the letter slowly filled with words that were, for the first time, true. November pressed on, and the cold with it, and Clara Ashford, who was Clara Boone now, legally, though she hadn't started thinking of herself that way, learned what it meant to live through the beginning of a hard winter beside a man who didn't believe in waste or weakness or letting anything fall apart if it could be mended. She learned the sound of the wind that meant more snow coming versus the wind that was just wind. She learned which floorboard Silas avoided stepping on at night so it wouldn't wake her. She learned that he had a way of going still when he was thinking hard about something, and that the thinking usually produced an answer, and that the answer was usually right. She learned that her father's prediction had been correct, which she would not have admitted to him if it killed her, but it was true. The man was solid in ways that had nothing to do with size or noise. One afternoon, she came in from the barn to find him patching a tear in her second-best dress, the one she hadn't said anything about because the needle was too fine for her cold, stiff fingers. He was bent over it at the table with the focused expression of a man doing something he wasn't sure he was doing right, but was going to do right anyway. She stood in the doorway for a moment. "You sew," she said. "My mother taught me, before she—" "Yes." He kept his eyes on the seam. "I'm not good at it, but I can close a tear." She came in and took off her coat and hung it up. "You could have just left it," she said. "I know." She sat down. "Silas." He looked up. She had about 6 things she wanted to say and couldn't figure out which one was actually the right one, so she just looked at him for a moment and then looked away at the window and the gray sky outside. "Thank you," she said, "for all of it. The things you don't say anything about." He looked back down at the seam. "You don't have to thank me." "I know I don't," she said. "That's why I'm doing it." Outside, the first serious snow of November had begun to fall, and inside the cabin the fire burned steady and warm, and somewhere between the needle and the thread and the plain, honest shape of a man doing a small thing carefully, Clara felt the last of something hard and guarded begin to come loose in her chest. She wasn't ready to name it yet, but she stopped pretending it wasn't there. The snow that had begun falling at the end of November did not stop. It came down in the particular way of mountain winters, not always hard, not always dramatic, but constant, patient, accumulating the way debt accumulates, adding up in the dark when you weren't watching until one morning you opened the door and the world had changed its shape entirely. The track to the settlement disappeared under 2 feet of it by the first week of December. The barn roof took on a white cap that Silas measured with his eye every morning, and twice he climbed up there in temperatures that made Clara's fingers ache just to watch him, knocking the load loose before it could stress the beams. She'd stopped pretending she wasn't watching him. That was the thing about the cabin. There wasn't much space to pretend anything. 1 main room, 1 bedroom, 1 door between the world and the 2 of them, and the world had gone white and silent and very far away. You learned a person fast in that kind of close quarters. You learned which silences were comfortable and which were the kind where something was being decided. You learned the particular rhythm of another person's breathing in the evening when they were tired, and the different rhythm when they were only pretending to read. Clara had learned all of these things about Silas Boone without meaning to, the way you absorb the weather, not as a decision, but as a fact. What she hadn't expected was how much she was learning about herself in the process. She had always believed, in the way of someone who'd never been seriously tested on the belief, that she was self-sufficient, capable, that she didn't need much from other people, and had long since made peace with that. And she was capable. She'd run her father's household since she was 16, and she'd done it competently and without complaint, and she was proud of that. But there was a difference she was discovering between managing alone and choosing to manage alone. And somewhere in the first weeks of November, she had started to notice the difference. It showed up in small ways. The morning she came in from the barn and his coffee was already made, and she took the cup he poured without thinking about it and drank half of it standing at the window before she realized she'd been waiting for exactly that, without knowing she was waiting. The evening she couldn't get the lamp wick trimmed at the right angle, and he came over without being asked and did it in 4 seconds, and she felt not irritated but relieved, and then irritated at the relief. The night she woke at 2 in the morning to the sound of wind she'd never heard before, a sustained high whine that vibrated in the walls, and lay rigid in the dark until she heard him move on the other side of the door, his boot on the loose board, and the sound of him going to check the shutters, and her whole body went easy again. She didn't tell him any of this. She wasn't ready to tell him any of this, but she filed it away in the part of her that was still trying to understand what was actually happening between them, which was a different project than the one she'd come in expecting to manage. December settled in hard around them, and they settled into each other without either of them naming it. There were things people in the settlement said about Silas Boone that Clara was hearing secondhand now, in pieces, when the occasional visitor made it up the North Road or when she and Silas managed the trip down. She heard them from Ruth Garrett, Mary's older sister-in-law, who'd come through in early December with a jar of preserved plums as a thank you for the night of the birthing. Ruth was a woman of 50 who had been in the valley since before the settlement had a name, and she had opinions about everything and delivered them with the satisfied precision of someone who'd earned the right. She sat at Clara's table with coffee and said, "People don't know what to make of him, you know, your husband." "I know," Clara said. "The trappers think he's strange because he doesn't drink with them. The farmers think he's standoffish because he doesn't linger and talk. The Caulfield brothers don't trust him because he won a land dispute with them 3 years back and did it cleanly, and they can't find a thing to fault him on, which irritates them more than if he'd cheated." Ruth sipped her coffee. "That man has no enemies because he doesn't give anyone enough to grab onto." "Is that good or bad?" Ruth looked at her sideways. "Depends on where you're standing." She set her cup down. "His first winter here? You know this?" "I don't know much," Clara said. "His first winter, there was a family, the Birch family. Eli Birch and his wife and 3 small ones came through late in the season trying to make it to the Laramie Valley and got caught by a storm 2 miles north of here. Silas found them, brought them in, kept them in this same cabin, for 6 weeks, slept in the barn himself." Clara was quiet. "Eli Birch tells that story every time he comes through," Ruth said. "Silas has never told it once. I know because I've asked him, direct, twice. Both times he looked at me like he didn't understand what I was trying to get him to say." She picked up her coffee. "That's who you married, in case you were still working it out." After Ruth left, Clara stood at the window for a long time, looking at the woodpile. Volk. She asked him about it that night. They were at the table after dinner. He was working on something with his hands, a piece of tack that needed mending, and she was supposedly reading but hadn't turned a page in 20 minutes. "The Birch family," she said. He didn't look up. "Ruth Garrett." "She told me, the first winter." He kept working the leather. "What about it?" "I wanted to hear it from you." "Not much to tell. They needed somewhere. I had somewhere. You slept in the barn for 6 weeks. Barn was warmer than it sounds." He pulled the thread through. "Eli Birch works harder than most men I've seen. He's done well for himself down in the valley. Good for him." She watched him, the needle going in and out, steady and even. "You don't want credit for it," she said. Not a question. "Credit for what? Doing what any person would do?" "Not any person. Not 6 weeks. Not the barn in January." He looked up then. His expression was the particular kind of level that she was coming to understand meant he was deciding how honest to be. "I had the space," he said. "They needed the space. The arithmetic wasn't hard. Most people make the arithmetic harder than it is." "Yeah," he said. "They do." He looked back down at the leather. "I never saw the point of that." She turned a page she hadn't read and stared at the words. "Silas," she said. Were you lonely before?" She said it carefully. "In the winters." A silence. The needle stopped moving. "Sometimes," he said finally. Flat and even, the way he said true things. "I'm sorry," she said. He looked up at her with something that wasn't quite surprise, but was close to it. "Don't be," he said. It was what it was. That doesn't mean it wasn't hard." He held her gaze for a moment, and she saw something move behind his eyes, something old and quietly contained. And then he looked back down at the leather and said, "No, it doesn't." They didn't say anything else about it, but the fire seemed warmer after that, and she went to bed that night feeling like she'd put her hand on something real. There was a man in the settlement named Douglas Cray, and Clara had not thought about him in years, which was how she'd preferred it. Douglas Cray was 35, broad-shouldered, the kind of loud that passed for confident among people who didn't look closely. He ran the supply store with his brother, and he had made it known 2 summers ago, through the particular mechanism of telling several people at a gathering rather than speaking to the relevant party directly, that he would have been a reasonable match for Clara Ashford if Edmund Ashford had seen fit to consider it. Clara had heard this secondhand and said nothing, and Edmund had heard it and said nothing, and Douglas Cray had taken the silence as mystery rather than answer. He came through on the North Road in mid-December, ostensibly on business, with his brother Mac and a third man Clara didn't recognize. She was coming back from the woodpile when they rode in, and she recognized Douglas immediately. The way he sat a horse, like he was performing the act of sitting a horse, back too straight, chin too high. He'd gotten heavier since she'd last seen him. Not fat, but solid in the way of a man who ate well and didn't do much that required the opposite. He swung down and pulled off his glove to shake her hand, which she shook and said, "Mrs. Boone, you're looking well," with the particular emphasis on Mrs. Boone that told her he was reminding himself of it. "Mr. Cray, what brings you up this way?" Needed to speak to Silas about a trapping agreement. Territorial question on the North Ridge. He glanced toward the cabin. "He in?" "He will be. He's on the line until midday." She looked at him. "You're welcome to wait," which was the correct hospitable thing to say. And she said it correctly, and went inside and put water on, and tried not to feel the particular irritation of a man's presence that she couldn't name a precise reason for. The three of them came in and sat at the table, and Clara made coffee and listened to them talk about the supply store, about a rumor that the railroad survey was coming closer, about the winter so far, and how it compared to previous ones. Douglas did most of the talking. The third man, whose name was Foster, barely spoke. Mac Cray was easy enough, she remembered. Quieter than his brother, steadier. The kind of person you forgot was in the room until you needed someone sensible. Silas came back at noon. He came in the way he always came in, knocked the snow from his boots on the porch, opened the door, took one look at the room and its contents, and adjusted without any visible change of expression. "Douglas," he said. "Silas?" Douglas stood and they shook hands. "Good winter so far." "Could be worse," Silas said, and hung up his coat and washed his hands at the basin. And Clara noticed that he put himself between Douglas and her side of the kitchen without seeming to notice he'd done it, the same way a tree grows toward light. Not a decision, just a natural movement toward something. The territorial conversation was, as far as Clara could follow, about a section of North Ridge that Silas had trapped for 3 seasons, and Douglas was now claiming his brother had rights to under a prior agreement with a man who'd since left the valley. Silas listened to all of it, asked 2 quiet questions, and then said, even and without heat, "The agreement with Hennessy was for the eastern face, not the ridge proper. I've got the survey mark. You're welcome to ride up and look at it." Douglas's jaw tightened slightly. Hennessy said the ridge was included. Then Hennessy was mistaken, or misspoke. The mark is the mark. Silas picked up his coffee. "If you want to dispute it, take it to Warren Caulfield. He knows what he wrote." Douglas looked at him for a moment with the expression of a man who'd expected more resistance and was recalibrating. Then he said, "We'll look at it in spring when the snow's off." "That's fine," Silas said. There was a brief silence in which something went out of Douglas Cray, not quietly, the way water drains, but in the particular way of a man who'd walked into a room expecting to be the most certain person in it and found the room already occupied. He turned to Clara. "Well, you've settled in well up here." "I have," she said. "Silas treating you all right?" She felt Silas go still beside her. Not tense, just still, the way he went still when he was waiting to see what she would do. "He is," she said. "Better than all right." She hadn't entirely planned to say that last part. It came out plain and direct, and once it was out, she found she didn't want to take it back. Douglas nodded with the smile of a man accepting something he'd hoped to complicate. "Good to hear." They left after another 20 minutes. Clara stood on the porch and watched them go, and Silas stood beside her until their horses were out of sight on the south road. "Old business?" he said. "Not really," she said. "More like something that thought it was going to be business and never got the chance." He looked at her. "He made it known, a couple years ago, that he would have offered," she said, "if my father had thought to ask." Silas said nothing. "I would have said no," she said. "For what it's worth." "I wasn't going to ask," he said. "I know. I'm telling you anyway." He looked out at the empty road and then back at her. And what she saw in his face was the quiet settling of something that she hadn't known was unsettled. "Let's go in," he said. "It's cold." "Yes," she said. "It is." They went into the inn. Bond. The thing about small spaces in winter is that they either make people or break them. She had seen it happen in families. Her mother had talked about it, the first hard winter she'd spent with Edmund, how you discovered things about a person that summer kept hidden, whether they turned inward when they were afraid or reached outward, whether their patience was real or just the performance of patience waiting for permission to run out. Whether the self they presented to the world was the same one that showed up at 2 in the morning when something went wrong. Silas, she was finding, was the same man at every hour. He didn't have a version of himself he produced for company and a different one he reverted to when no one was watching. What she saw in the morning was what she got at midnight. The consistency of him was something she kept bumping into like a piece of furniture in an unfamiliar room. She'd reach for where she expected something conditional to be and find instead something solid. It was disorienting in the way that unexpectedly good things are always disorienting. It took her a while to trust it. There was a night in the second week of December when she burned the dinner badly. Not just scorched, fully burned. A stew she'd been making her whole life and had let go too long while she was rehemming a coat. She stood at the stove with the ruined pot and felt a kind of disproportionate, furious despair about it that she recognized, even in the moment, had nothing to do with the stew. She was tired. She was further from her father than she'd ever been and couldn't get to him. She was spending her 21st winter in a mountain cabin married to a man she hadn't chosen, and the truth that she was starting not to mind was somehow more frightening than the original situation had been. She stood at the stove with the burned pot. Silas came in from outside, took one breath of the smoke-edged air, looked at her face, and said nothing at all about the pot. He went to the storeroom and came back with salt pork and leftover biscuits and the end of the cheese she'd been rationing, and he put them on the table and said, "Sit down. The pot needs scrubbing. It'll keep. That's what you said the morning you told me about the—" She stopped. I'm sorry. I don't know why I'm—" She stopped again. "You don't have to explain it," he said. "I burned the dinner. You burned a pot of stew. It's not the end of anything." He pulled out her chair. "Sit down, Clara. Eat something." She sat. She ate salt pork and cold biscuits, and she didn't cry, which she'd been very close to, and he sat across from her and ate the same things without complaint, and at some point poured her a cup of the apple brandy he kept in the high cabinet, just a small one, and set it in front of her. She looked at it. "My mother made it," he said, "before she passed. I've been saving it." She looked up at him. "Don't make a thing of it," he said. "Just drink it." She drank it. It was warm and apple sweet, and it hit somewhere she needed it to hit, and she exhaled slowly. "Thank you," she said. He took the burned pot and started scrubbing it without being asked, which she hadn't expected, and she watched his back and thought, "I'm in a great deal of trouble here. Not the bad kind, just the kind that changes things." So, the settlement had its own rhythms even in winter. Its arguments, its alliances, its small dramas that felt enormous in the compressed quiet of the season. Claire and Silas went down when they could, which was not often, and gathered what news there was and brought it back. The news in December was mostly the same. The cold, the supply situation, who was running low on what, a dispute between two families over a fence line that had been an argument since October and would probably still be one in March. But there were also the quieter pieces. That old Morton Vance's wife had taken sick and likely wouldn't see spring. That the Harmon family's second son had come back from an attempted crossing of the pass and would be staying through the winter, adding another mouth to an already lean household. That the settlement as a whole was tighter than usual. The summer harvest had been decent but not exceptional, and a long winter stretched what decent had meant in September to something more uncertain by January. Silas knew this without being told. He had a way of reading the settlement the way he read his trapline, looking at the signs, putting the pieces together, understanding what the pattern said about what was coming. Clara noticed that he had started doing the accounting of their own stores differently, more careful, more deliberate. She came into the storeroom one afternoon and found him with a piece of paper and the particular focused stillness of a man doing arithmetic he didn't like the outcome of. "What is it?" she said. "We're fine," he said. "I'm just working out some numbers." She looked at the shelves. They were well stocked. She'd been impressed since the beginning by how thoroughly he'd prepared, but she was starting to have a sense, living here, for what fine meant versus what comfortable meant. "Who are you thinking about giving to?" she said. He looked at her. "Don't," she said. "I've been watching you. When you come back from the settlement and you go quiet and then come in here and look at the shelves, I know what that means, a silence." He folded the piece of paper. The Harmons, he said. They've got an extra person through the winter and their eldest isn't well. By February, they'll be short. What else? He looked at the paper. Morton Vance is spending most of his time at his wife's bedside and not much time on his trapline. His stores won't last. And Tom Garrett's family. They've got the new baby, and Mary hasn't been strong since the birthing. That's 3 families, Claire said. Yes. She was quiet for a moment. She looked at the shelves, at the careful, deliberately built stores of a man who had spent 3 winters alone and stocked accordingly for 1 person, and then had added for 2 when he knew she was coming, and had still managed to come out with enough to look at his neighbor's shortfalls and wonder. What do we need to get through to April? She said. He started to say something that was probably, it's not your problem to, what do we need? She said. Not what we have. What do we actually need? He told her. She looked at the shelves and did her own arithmetic. We can give the Harmons the extra cornmeal and the salt pork I put up last month, she said. You can take Morton Vance the dried venison. That back rack, we won't get through it before it turns. The Garretts need something for the baby more than anything. Do you have any of the dried apple left? Half a crate, he said. I'll make up a parcel. He was looking at her with an expression she hadn't seen before, or maybe she had and hadn't known what it was. Clara says, we're fine, she said. You said so yourself. We're fine, so let's be useful. He was quiet. Then, all right. They put together 3 parcels that afternoon, working in the storeroom side by side, her organizing and him packing, and they didn't make a production of it. The next morning, he loaded the parcels in the sled and took them down to the settlement and came back by evening and said nothing much about it, which was the right way to handle it. She'd known he would handle it that way. She was counting on that kind of thing now, she realized. She had started to know what he would do before he did it. That, she was learning, was what trust actually felt like. Not a decision you made, but a knowledge you accumulated, slowly, the way snow accumulates, until one day you looked and there was more of it than you'd realized. Christmas came through the valley the way holidays do in hard winters. Quietly, without much ceremony, but not without feeling. They had no particular traditions between them. Clara had grown up with her mother's cooking and the small rituals her family had made their own. The particular bread, the reading aloud in the evenings, the way her father always tried to make the house look a little nicer, even when there wasn't much to work with. She didn't know what Silas had grown up with, and she found herself wanting to ask, and not quite knowing how to begin. She began by making the bread. Her mother's recipe, the one that required 2 risings, and a particular handling of the crust that she'd practiced until she could do it in the dark. She started it on Christmas Eve morning, and Silas came into the kitchen around noon and stopped, just inside the door, and looked at what she was doing, and something passed over his face that he controlled quickly. Your mother's? He said. How do you know that? You're more careful with it than with your regular bread. You check it more. She looked at him. My mother used to check it every 20 minutes. She said you had to listen to it. What does it sound like? She said when it was right, it was quiet. When it needed more time, it made a sound like it was working. Clara looked at the dough under its cloth. I never could hear what she heard, but I check anyway. He came and stood beside her and looked at the dough. Not doing anything, just standing there, close enough that she could feel the cold coming off his coat. She sounds like she was good, he said. She was. Clara put her hand on the cloth. She would have asked you 100 questions and known everything about you inside an hour. Is that a compliment? The best kind. He was quiet. She felt him look at her profile. My mother, he started. Stopped. She used to make a thing at Christmas. I don't even know what it was called. Some bread from her own mother, from further east, with seeds in it. He looked at the table. I only had it a few times. She died when I was 12. Clara said nothing. She waited. I don't remember it clearly, he said. Just the smell of it, and her standing in a kitchen that was much worse than this one, acting like it was the most important thing in the world. A pause. Maybe it was. Maybe it was, Clara said. They stood at the table together and the bread rose under its cloth and neither of them moved for a while. And it was the most comfortable she had felt in his presence yet. Not because anything had changed, but because something had been given. A small, real thing, The kind that costs more than it looks like. She made a good dinner that night. The bread came out well. Not perfect, never perfect. The crust had a crack in it she wouldn't have wanted, but good and solid. And the cabin smelled like her mother's kitchen, and she found that she didn't mind the crack. They ate and talked more than usual. She told him about her mother. Small stories, the kind that carry a person. Her habit of naming the chickens after people she found irritating. The way she'd sung completely off-key and refused to acknowledge it. Her opinion of store-bought pie, which was delivered with the conviction of a judge. He listened to all of it with the full attention she'd come to recognize as simply how he listened and laughed at the right places. Real laughter, the quiet kind, which was apparently what he had. He told her about his father, a little. The trap line they'd run together. His father's conviction that the mountains had opinions about people, and that you could read them if you were patient enough. "Did you believe that?" she said. "I do now," he said. "I just call it something different." "What do you call it?" He thought about it. Pattern. Everything leaves one. If you pay attention long enough, you start to see it. "What's my pattern?" she said, and then felt heat rise in her face at the directness of it. He looked at her across the table, and for a moment she thought he was going to deflect. "Careful," he said instead. "Everything you do carefully. You don't miss much. You watch things before you trust them." He held her eyes. "And when you decide something's worth trusting, you don't go back on it." She held his gaze. "Is that what you see?" she said. "That's what I see," he said. "Yes." Outside, the wind had dropped, which was unusual, and the silence it left behind was the deep, still kind that only comes in the heart of a mountain winter, when everything has gone quiet under the weight of snow and the world seems to be holding something in before it says it. She looked down at her plate. When she looked up, he was still watching her. "Merry Christmas," she said, because she didn't have another word for what the evening felt like. "Merry Christmas," he said, and meant it. The days after Christmas deepened into the serious cold of January. And January in that valley was not a gentle thing. The temperature dropped past what the thermometer on the porch was built to measure. The horses needed blanketing even in the barn. Clara's face, on the brief necessary trips between cabin and barn, went numb in under 2 minutes, and the air hurt to breathe if you didn't cover your mouth. At night, the cabin walls made sounds she hadn't heard in October. Groans and sharp cracks as the cold pressed in and the logs contracted. She'd learned to sleep through them, but the first few nights she'd lain rigid, listening to the cabin speak its frozen language. Silas kept the stove fed through the night. She knew this because she could hear him getting up, that careful step, avoiding the loose board, and the sound of the stove door and the log going in. 3, 4 times a night, sometimes. She'd offered to take a shift. He'd said no, he was a light sleeper anyway, which was true, but wasn't the reason. One night she woke at the absolute worst hour, that cold, dark 3 in the morning that feels like the night has no intention of ever ending, and she heard him come back from the stove, and then, not the sound of him settling on the bunk, but the sound of him stopping. She lay still. "Clara," he said very quietly. "You awake?" "Yes." A pause. "The temperature's dropped badly. Another 5 degrees and I'll be worried about the pipes on the north side." Another pause. "I'm going to bank it higher. It'll get warm in there." "All right," she said. "I wanted you to know, in case you woke up and it was different." She lay there in the dark. "Silas," she said. "Yeah." "Are you all right? Out there?" A silence. She couldn't see him through the door. "I'm fine," he said. "Go back to sleep." She didn't go back to sleep. She lay awake and listened to the stove and the wind and the sounds of him moving around the main room, checking things, quietly and methodically, in the dark. And she thought about a man who got up 4 times a night in 20 below cold to make sure she stayed warm and never once mentioned it. And she thought, "I did not ask for you. I did not choose you. And I don't know what to do with the fact that you are exactly what a person would choose if they were wise enough to know what to choose." She pressed her face into the pillow and closed her eyes. The cabin warmed. The pipes on the north side held. In the morning he made coffee and handed her a cup and said nothing about the night. And she took the cup and looked at him over it, and he looked back at her with his quiet, honest face, and what passed between them had no name she was willing to say out loud yet. But it was there. It had been there for a while now, she supposed. She was just finally done pretending she couldn't see it. The cold that came in the second week of January was different from anything that had come before it. Clara knew cold. She had grown up in this valley, and she'd lived through hard winters, and she understood, in the practical way of someone who had split firewood and banked stoves since she was old enough to hold an axe, that cold was not a single thing but a spectrum. The brisk cold of October, the serious cold of November, the committed cold of December that settled in and meant business. She thought she knew what January held. She was wrong. This was the kind of cold that changed the quality of the air itself. It didn't bite. It pressed, constant and total, as if the temperature had decided to make a structural argument. The snow that had fallen through December was now a hard-packed layer that didn't creak under boots so much as ring, like walking on something that had given up any intention of ever thawing. The sky in the mornings was a white so pale it was almost colorless, and the sun, when it appeared at all, sat low and far away and gave light without warmth, which Clara had always thought was the particular cruelty of January. All that brightness and none of the good of it. Silas moved through it the way he moved through everything, with the deliberate, unhurried focus of a man who understood that panic in cold weather cost calories you couldn't afford to lose. He went to his trapline in temperatures that made her wince to watch him dress for, layered in wool and canvas and the heavy buffalo coat he'd had for years, the collar up past his jaw. He came back in the afternoons with his beard half iced and his hands stiff, and she had coffee waiting, and he thawed in stages, the way cold stiffened things always do, slowly, from the inside out. She didn't fuss over him. She'd learned early that he didn't want fussing, and she wasn't naturally inclined toward it anyway. She just had the coffee ready and the extra wood in the box so the stove could be banked up high. And sometimes, more often now, without ceremony, she'd take his coat when he came in and hang it for him while he worked the feeling back into his fingers, because it was easier than watching him try to do it one-handed. He'd stopped saying you don't have to do that somewhere in the first week of January. She'd stopped waiting to be told it was all right. That was its own kind of progress. So the first indication that January was going to be something beyond what either of them had prepared for came on a Tuesday, when Silas came back from the settlement in the early afternoon with his jaw set in the way she'd learned meant he'd seen something he hadn't liked. She was at the table mending when he came in. She looked at his face and waited. "Morton Vance," he said, hanging his coat. "He's in bad shape." She set down the mending. "How bad?" "He hasn't been eating properly. His wife died 3 days ago, and nobody knew until the Harmon boy went down to check on him." He went to the basin and washed his hands. "He's not sick exactly. He's just stopped." Clara understood what that meant. She'd seen it in people after loss, by the way grief could make the ordinary machinery of living seem pointless. Eating, sleeping, feeding the stove. Why do any of it? "What does he need?" she said. "Someone to check on him." "He won't ask." Silas dried his hands. "I'm going to go down 3 times a week. Bring him something each time." "I'll make extra when I cook," she said. He looked at her. "Clara." "I'll make extra," she said again. "That's not a discussion." He closed his mouth, nodded. She went back to her mending, and he went to the storeroom, and neither of them made more of it than that. But that evening, when she put the extra portion in the covered pot for him to take in the morning, she felt him watching her from across the room, and when she looked up, his expression had that quality she'd seen only a few times. The open, unguarded look of a man who was in the presence of something that had surprised him, even though he was trying not to show it. She looked away first, but she kept it, the way you keep small things that matter. The storm that came on the 4th of January announced itself the way the worst storms always did, not loudly, but with a particular quality of stillness in the hours before. The wind stopped. The temperature dropped another 10 degrees in the space of an afternoon. The horses were restless in the barn in a way that was different from cold restless, agitated, bumping the stall boards, which they only did when they were reading something in the air that the people around them hadn't caught yet. Silas read it too. Clara watched him come back from the barn at dusk with a look on his face she hadn't seen before, and she said, "What is it?" "Big one coming," he said. "Tonight, maybe. Tomorrow morning at the latest." She looked at the sky, which had gone the flat and featureless white, that was either a weatherless sky or a sky that had decided to become all weather. How long? 2 days, maybe 3. He went inside and began moving with a focused efficiency that she matched without being told to. They each knew, by now, what the other would reach for first. He brought in wood, stack after stack, until the area beside the stove was full, and then he started a second pile by the bedroom door. She checked the food stocks, the lamp oil, the candles, the extra blankets she'd moved from the chest in the bedroom to within arm's reach of the stove. She filled the water containers from the well while it was still possible to make the trip without a rope. "The water barrels," he said, coming back in. "Done," she said. He stopped, looked at her. "I grew up here too," she said. "I know that," he said. Yes. Thank you." They ate an early dinner and banked the stove high, and the storm arrived at roughly 2 in the morning. Not gradually, but all at once. A wall of wind and snow that hit the cabin like something that had been waiting to make its point. Clara sat up in bed listening to it. The sound was immense. Not a howl, but a sustained roar. The voice of something very large that had no interest in being quiet about what it was. She got up, she put on her heaviest socks and her robe, and went to the door of the bedroom and opened it. Silas was already up. He was sitting in the chair nearest the stove with his back straight and his eyes on the ceiling, listening to the cabin. She could see him reading it, each creak and groan and pop of stressed timber, the way she'd watched him read his trapline, cataloging, assessing, deciding what required action and what could be left alone. He looked at her when she appeared in the doorway. "You should sleep," he said. "You're not sleeping." "I'm used to watching storms." She came in and sat on the edge of his bunk, the narrow cot beside the stove where he slept, which was now so familiar to her that she stopped registering it as particularly close. The stove radiated heat, and the wind was so loud that the silence inside the cabin felt borrowed. "Tell me something," she said. He looked at her. "What kind of something?" "Anything. Talk. It helps." A pause. He shifted in the chair and looked at the stove door. "When I was about 14, he said, my father and I got caught out on the ridge in a storm. Not as big as this one, but big. We were 2 miles from the cabin and we'd been checking the upper lines. The wind came up fast and we couldn't see past 10 feet. He paused. My father stopped walking. What did he do? He sat down in the snow, Silas said, right there on the ridge, and I thought he'd given up, which scared me more than the storm. And then he said, sit down, son. You fight a storm, it beats you. You outlast it, you win. So we sat. Clara was quiet. We built a windbreak out of snow and we sat in it for 4 hours, he said. Storm passed. We walked home. I made the fire and he made coffee and we didn't talk about it. Were you scared? I was terrified, he said plainly. The whole time. I just didn't let it make me stupid. She looked at the stove. Is that what you're doing now? More or less. And what does outlasting it look like tonight? He was quiet for a moment. Staying warm, watching for structural stress on the roof, keeping the stove going. He glanced at her. Not letting it make me stupid. She nodded. She pulled the blanket from the bunk around her shoulders and settled back against the wall. Then I'll stay up with you, she said. He looked at her for a moment like he might object, and then something in him decided not to, and he turned back to the stove. All right, he said. They sat through the night. She slept for an hour around 4 and woke to find him exactly where he'd been, a cup of cold coffee in his hand, watching the cabin do its winter work. She made fresh coffee and they shared it and watched the light outside the shuttered windows go from black to pale gray as the storm settled in for its second day. It was on the third day of the storm, when the wind had dropped enough to move outside but the snow was still coming in sheets, that Silas told her about her father. She'd been trying not to think about Edmund. The storm had made the settlement as unreachable as the moon. 2 miles of drifted road, and this visibility might as well have been 200. She told herself her father had shelter, had neighbors close enough, had the supplies she knew Silas had made sure of. She told herself this regularly, in the systematic way of a person who is managing what they cannot change. She must have been quieter than usual on the third morning, because Silas looked at her across the breakfast table and said, He'll be all right. She looked at her coffee. You don't know that. No, he said. But the Harmon place is 40 yards from his. They'll check on him. He hates asking for help. I know. A pause. That's where you got it. She looked up. He had the expression of a man who hadn't quite meant to say that and was deciding whether to take it back. He didn't. Your father is one of the most stubborn men I know, he said, in a good way. He doesn't bend to things. He finds another way through. He picked up his cup. He told me once when we were talking, this was before any of this, that his greatest fear wasn't dying. It was leaving you with nobody who understood what you were worth. Clara was very still. He said that, she said. Last August. We were at the trading post and he'd had a bad week with his health and he was thinking out loud, I suppose. He said you'd spent 4 years keeping that house together and nobody had thought to tell you it was extraordinary. Silas set his cup down. He was wrong about one thing, by the way. What thing? He said nobody had noticed. People had noticed. They just didn't know what to say about a woman who did everything right and made it look like nothing. She pressed her hand flat against the table. The storm moved against the south wall. Is that why you agreed? She said. When he asked you. Silas was quiet for a moment. Partly, he said. What's the other part? He looked at her. Directly. The way he looked at things he was taking seriously. I'd been watching you for 2 summers, he said. At the trading post, at the gatherings. Not... He stopped. Adjusted. Not in a way I thought I had a right to act on. I noticed you. The way you moved through a room. The way you talked to people. Even people who weren't worth your time. The way you never seemed to need anyone to confirm anything for you. He picked up his cup again. When your father asked me, I thought, I could spend a long time doing a lot worse than being the man who gets to know that person. Clara looked at her hands. You told him it should be my choice, she said. It should have been. But you came anyway. Yes, he said, simply, without dressing it up. She sat with that for a moment. The fire in the stove, the storm against the walls, the plain, honest weight of what he'd said sitting between them on the table. I'm glad you came, she said. She said it quietly, and she didn't look at him when she said it, because if she'd looked at him, she would have had to deal with what was on his face, and she wasn't quite ready for that yet. But she heard him exhale, slowly, like something that had been held for a long time finding its way out. Good, he said. Just that. The storm broke on the morning of the 4th day. The world it left behind was transformed in the violent way of serious storms, drifts that reached the eaves on the north side of the cabin, the track to the road invisible, the barn door requiring 45 minutes of combined effort to dig free. The sky came out clean and hard and blue, the particular blue of a winter sky after a storm that looks like an apology. Silas had the horses out and moving within the hour. Clara cleared the porch and the path between cabin and barn. They worked side by side in the cold without talking much, and when they were done they stood in the yard and looked at the changed white world, and then Silas said, I'm going to the settlement. She looked at him. Your father, he said. The road. I've got the snowshoes. It'll take longer, but I can get through. He was already turning back toward the cabin for his gear. I'll check on Morton Vance while I'm down there. And the Harmons. I'm coming, she said. Clara, it's 2 miles on snowshoes and 4 feet of snow. I know what 2 miles is. He stopped, turned, looked at her with the expression he wore when he was deciding if this was a fight worth having, and he almost always decided it wasn't. You've never done snowshoes, he said. Show me. He showed her. It took 15 minutes in the yard, which was 15 minutes of frustration. Snowshoes had a particular logic to them that the body had to learn, and the body initially refused. And she fell twice, and he didn't laugh, but she could see the effort of not laughing clearly enough on his face that she almost did it herself. Wait forward, he said for the 3rd time. You're fighting the shoe. Let it do its job. The shoe is fighting me. From where I'm standing, you're even, he said. She looked at him. He was absolutely straight-faced. She pressed her lips together. Fine, she said. Wait forward. They made it to the settlement in just over an hour and a half, which Silas said was good time. Clara's legs, by the last quarter mile, were communicating with her in terms she would not have used in polite company, and she understood with her body, in a way she hadn't quite before, what it meant that he did this for miles in the dead of winter with a loaded pack. Edmund Ashford's house was standing, smoke from the chimney, which was the first thing she looked for. She hit the porch at something close to a run and knocked, and after a moment her father opened the door, thinner than she remembered, or maybe the 4 weeks had made the thinning more visible, and looked at her with an expression that started at surprise and arrived at something that made her throat tighten. "Clara, girl," he said. She put her arms around him. She felt how much narrower he was. She didn't say anything about it. Inside, the house was colder than she'd have liked. Not dangerously so, but the stove had been let go lower than she would have kept it. She started in on it immediately while Edmund and Silas sat at the table, and she listened to them talk while she built the fire back up. They talked about the storm, the road, the settlement's general situation. Silas told him about Morton Vance, and Edmund's face went sad and knowing. He'd heard about the wife. They talked about the Harmon boy who'd apparently done a circuit of the nearest houses the morning after the storm broke, knocking on doors, which Silas said was a good thing. "Good boy," Edmund said. "That family doesn't get enough credit." "No," Silas agreed. A pause. "How is she?" Edmund said quietly. "She's right there," Silas said, equally quiet. "You could ask her." "I'm asking you." Another pause. Claire kept her eyes on the stove door. "She's good," Silas said. "Better than good. She's come into her own up there. You'd be proud of her." A beat. "You should be proud of her." "I've always been proud of her," Edmund said. "She knows that, I hope." "You might tell her again sometime," Silas said. "In those words. People need to hear the actual words." Silence. Clara's hand was still on the stove handle, and she wasn't moving because she was very focused on breathing at a normal rate. "Thank you," Edmund said after a moment, "for taking care of her." "She takes care of herself," Silas said. I'm around." Edmund made a sound that might have been a laugh. "You're around. That's one way to put it." Clara stood up and turned around, and her father was looking at her with tired eyes that held something she recognized as relief in its deepest form. The relief of a person who had made a gamble on someone else's behalf and was starting to believe it had come out right. "The stove will hold now," she said. "Thank you," her father said. "I'm going to check what you have in your pantry," she said. "Don't argue." "Would it help if I argued?" "No." "Then I won't." She checked his stores. He was lower than she'd have liked on a few things, better than she'd feared on others. She reorganized what he had, so the most accessible things were the ones he needed daily, and she made a mental note of what to bring down on their next visit. Then she came back to the table and sat with them, and her father poured coffee from a pot that was only barely warm, and it tasted terrible, and she drank it without saying so. Edmund watched her and Silas across the table with the particular expression of a man who'd spent months worrying about a thing, and was now watching the worry loosen its grip. "You two look like you've worked something out," he said. Clara looked at Silas. Silas looked at Clara. "We're working on it," Clara said. Edmund nodded slowly. That was enough for him. On the way back, the light already going golden and thin in the late afternoon sky, Clara's legs had found their complaint and were expressing it continuously. She was not going to say so. She kept pace beside Silas on the snowshoed track and kept her weight forward the way he'd shown her and watched the mountain ridges go pink in the low sun. About halfway home, she said, "What you said to my father, about telling people the words." He was quiet for a moment. He needed to hear it. "You were right." She watched her feet on the snow. "Is that something do you do that with everyone? Point out what people need to hear?" "No," he said. "Just people you care about?" A pause that lasted the length of several snowshoe steps. "More or less," he said. She looked at the track ahead of them and didn't press it, but she carried it the rest of the way home, warm in her chest like something the cold couldn't reach. January pressed on. The temperature moderated after the storm, not warmly, but into the range of merely brutal rather than something that defied reason. Silas went back to his lines. Clara kept the cabin, kept the fire, started a second project she hadn't told him about. The extra blankets she was making from the wool she'd found in the storeroom. Enough for one more bed, sized for... She didn't examine exactly what she was planning them for. She made her trips down to the settlement twice a week now. Morton Vance had started eating again, partly because the Harmon family had taken to checking on him daily, and partly because she'd brought him 3 good meals over 2 weeks, and sat with him while he ate them and asked him questions about his wife. And he'd needed to talk about her badly enough that eating while talking was easier than he'd expected. His name was Morton, but he'd told his wife, Bess, her name was Bess, to call him Mort, and nobody else had ever called him that. And Clara called him Mort now and watched something in him relax each time. She told Silas about this on one of the evenings. "That's a good thing you're doing," he said. "He just needed someone to stay," she said. "That's all it was." "That's not nothing," Silas said. She looked at him. "No, I know it's not." He was quiet a moment. "You're good with people who need something but won't ask." "I know what it looks like," she said, "when someone needs and won't ask." He held her gaze. They both understood she wasn't only talking about Morton Vance. "Yeah," he said. "You do." It was Ruth Garrett who told her. Ruth came through on a clear day in the third week of January, ostensibly to return a pie tin she'd borrowed before Christmas, and actually, Clara understood, because Ruth was a woman who took the temperature of things regularly and believed in doing so in person. They sat at the table with coffee, and Ruth talked about the settlement news. The fence dispute had been settled. The Harmon family's extra mouth had proven useful after all, because the man was good with horses. The Caulfield brothers were being difficult about something again, which was not news. And then she set her cup down and looked at Clara in the direct way she had and said, "You know he tried to give the arrangement back." Clara looked up. "What?" "Silas, when your father first came to him, he told Edmund to let you decide." Edmund insisted, and Silas told him. Ruth paused, as if getting the words right. "He told your father that if he forced this and the girl spent her life resenting it, he would never forgive himself for being party to it." His exact words, near enough. Clara was still. "Edmund told you this?" she said. "Edmund told me last September when he was worried it had been the wrong thing to do. He needed to tell someone." Ruth wrapped both hands around her cup. "He said Silas had argued for you twice. Said if the circumstances were different, if there was more time, he'd have found a way to let you choose freely and trusted you to come to the right conclusion yourself." "He trusted me to come to the right conclusion," Clara said slowly. "Those were Edmund's words. He said Silas seemed to think—" Ruth looked at her carefully. "He seemed to think you were the kind of person who, given enough time and enough space to see someone clearly, would make the right call." Clara looked at the window, the pine ridge outside, the pale winter sky. "He bet on me," she said. "He bet everything on you," Ruth said. "From the beginning, he just didn't tell you because it wasn't the kind of thing you lead with when you've been a stranger to someone for a week." Clara was quiet for a long time. Ruth finished her coffee and stood up and put her coat on, and didn't say anything more about it, because Ruth Garrett was a woman who knew when to speak, and more importantly, when not to. After she left, Clara sat at the table for a very long time. Then she got up and started dinner, and she made enough for two, and when Silas came in from the line that evening, she watched him cross the room and hang up his coat and wash his hands, and she thought about a man who had argued twice for her freedom and then shown up anyway because he thought she was worth knowing, and she thought about the blanket she was making that was sized for a second person in a room that currently held only one. She thought, all right then, enough. Thumped. The coldest night of the year came on a Wednesday in the last week of January. It came without the drama of a storm, just a steady, sustained, pitiless cold that Silas measured in the morning and said nothing about except to bank the stove so high that the main room was warm as summer by noon. Clara checked the thermometer on the porch 3 times in the afternoon and didn't like what she saw any of the 3 times. By evening, the temperature outside was the coldest she had ever seen recorded in her life. The cabin was handling it. The logs held, the stove worked, the weather stripping she had fixed in October was doing its job. But the cold was inside too, in the way that extreme cold finds the gaps in things. She could feel it along the north wall. The window in the bedroom would accumulate frost on the inside by morning. She and Silas ate dinner and cleaned up, and he banked the stove again, and she stood at the bedroom door and looked at the room and thought about the thin cold she would feel by 2 in the morning, even with the extra blankets, and then she turned around. He was sitting in his chair. He'd picked up his book, but he wasn't reading it. "Silas?" she said. He looked up. She stood in the doorway for a moment, and then she said, "I don't want to be sensible about tonight." He was very still. "I'm going to put the extra blankets on the bed," she said carefully, watching his face. "And I would like you to come in, if you want to, because it's going to be too cold in here by 3 in the morning and—" She stopped. "And because I want you to. That's the real reason." He looked at her for a long moment. "Clara," he said, "you don't have to—" "I know I don't have to," she said. "That's why I'm asking." He was quiet. She watched something in him steady itself, the way a compass needle finds north. "All right," he said. She turned and went to the bedroom and spread the extra blankets, and he came in after a minute, and they did not make a production of any of it. The cold outside pressed against the walls and the stove held steady, and they lay in the narrow bed in the familiar dark, and she felt the warmth of him beside her, and thought that this was the most honest thing that had happened since October. He reached over, in the dark, and his hand found hers. She held it. Outside the wind had come back, low and cold, testing the seams of things. Inside the cabin the fire held, and the walls held, and everything that mattered stayed exactly where it was supposed to be. "Silas," she said into the dark. "Yeah." "Thank you," she said, "for arguing with my father." A silence. "He told you," he said. "Ruth Garrett told me." He told her. Another silence, longer this time. "Did it change anything?" he said. She thought about it honestly, the way she tried to think about things that mattered. "No," she said. "It just explained what I already knew." His hand tightened around hers slightly and then settled. "Go to sleep," he said. "It's going to be a cold morning." "I know," she said. But she lay awake a while longer, listening to the wind work against the cabin and the stove do its quiet, faithful work. And she held onto his hand in the dark, and she thought that she had come up here in October as one kind of person, and she was becoming slowly, without planning to, a different kind, one that she liked considerably better. She fell asleep before she could examine that thought any further, and she slept warmly and well until morning, when the cold was exactly as serious as they'd expected, and they faced it together as they'd been facing everything for the past 3 months, which was to say, not easily, not perfectly, but side by side, and without turning away. February arrived without apology. The cold didn't break. It shifted, the way January cold always shifted into February cold, trading raw brutality for something more personal, a sustained pressure that got into your joints and your thinking, and the small spaces between what you meant to feel and what you actually felt. But something else had shifted too, inside the cabin, and both of them knew it, and neither of them was in any particular hurry to examine it too closely or too soon, because some things need the right kind of quiet before you can say them out loud. What had changed was simpler than Clara had expected, and more complicated than she could have prepared for. She woke in the mornings beside him now. Not every morning. There were mornings she was up before he was, and mornings he rose before light to check the stove, but enough mornings that the shape of him in the early dark had become part of the texture of waking up, like the sound of the wind or the smell of the stove. She had not predicted that she would find this comforting. She had not predicted a lot of things about Silas Boone, and she was starting to think that the not predicting had been, in its way, its own kind of gift. You can't brace against something you didn't see coming. And what she hadn't seen coming was this: the profound, uncomplicated relief of being known, not performed for, not managed, not handled carefully the way people handle someone they're worried about, just known. He knew when she was tired and didn't need to be talked to. He knew when she was thinking hard about something and the thinking wasn't finished. He knew the difference between her quiet that meant content and her quiet that meant something was working in her that she hadn't resolved yet, and he treated those two silences differently without making a study of it. She wondered sometimes if he knew how much she noticed that. She suspected he did. She suspected he counted on it. She was starting to count on a great many things about Silas Boone, and the counting no longer frightened her the way it had in November when she'd first caught herself doing it. It had settled from fear into something she thought might be the beginning of certainty, which was a rare and more valuable thing than she'd previously appreciated. The first week of February brought a brief thaw. Not real warmth, nothing close, but a moderation in temperature that turned the top layer of snow to a wet crust and made the air smell, for 2 or 3 days, like the very far edge of something that might eventually become spring. It wouldn't. Everyone in the valley knew it wouldn't. February in the mountains was not spring's beginning, It was winter's second argument. But those few days of relative lightness had their effect on people. The way a rest in the middle of hard work changes what comes after. Not easier, necessarily, but faced differently. Silas used the moderation to make the trip to the settlement twice in close succession, covering the ground that the January storms had made difficult. Clara went with him both times, her snowshoe form now smooth enough that she didn't have to think about it, which Silas had noted without making a thing of it, except to say, once, that she was faster than most men he'd taken out on them the first time. She'd said, "Most men fight the shoe," and he'd said, "You did too." And she'd said, "I learned faster," and he'd said, "Yes, you did." And there was a quality to those 4 words that she carried the rest of the walk. On the first trip, they checked on Morton Vance, who was doing measurably better. He'd gotten out of the house twice in the past week, once to help the Harmon boy fix a fence post that had heaved in the freeze, once just to walk, he said, because Bess had always said walking was the thing when you felt like you were sinking. He said this to Clara with the steady look of a man who had found something to hold on to and was holding it. She told him Bess sounded like a sensible woman. He said she'd been the most sensible person he'd ever known, and then he looked away. And there were a few seconds that Clara let be what they were, without trying to fill them. On the second trip, they went down to check on Edmund. Her father was weaker than he'd been in January. Not dramatically. This was the slow kind of weakening, the kind that showed up in small things, the way he got up from his chair, the pace of his words, the way his hands rested in his lap when he wasn't doing anything rather than fidgeting the way they used to. He had been a man of constant small motion, her father, always adjusting something, picking something up, turning it over. Still hands-on, Edmund Ashford were new, and she noticed them immediately and didn't say anything. They stayed longer than usual. Silas took a look at the roof again and found a section of the patch he'd done in November had shifted slightly in the storms, not failed, but worth attention, and spent 2 hours on it in the cold while Clara sat inside with her father, and they talked in the comfortable, rambling way of people who have a great deal of time to make up for and not enough of it. "He's good on a roof," Edmund said, watching Silas through the window. "He's good at most things," Claire said. "You don't say that like it surprises you anymore." "It doesn't." She looked at her father. "It did, at first." Edmund was quiet a moment. "Are you happy, Clara?" She thought about it, really thought, the way he'd always taught her to. Not the first answer, which was usually the easiest one, but the actual one underneath. "I'm not unhappy," she said. "That's where I started. And then I was something else. Something that doesn't have a clean name yet." She looked at the window, at the figure moving on the roof. "But yes, I think happy is somewhere in the direction I'm going." Edmund exhaled. It was a long, slow breath, and she recognized it as the sound of something released. "That's enough," he said. "That's more than enough." When Silas came back in, his face was reddened from cold, and his hands needed warming, and Clara poured him coffee, and her father watched them move around each other in the small kitchen with the expression of a man watching something he'd hoped for and only half believed would come. On the walk home, in the late afternoon light that came down gold and thin off the ridges, Silas said, "He's getting worse." "I know," she said. "I want to go down more often, once the road clears a little more." "I was going to ask you to," she said. He glanced at her sideways. "I know." She looked at the track ahead, the boot and snowshoe prints they'd made this morning, already softening in the brief thaw. "Silas, I want to say something." "All right." "I know what you're doing," she said. "Going down there, fixing the roof, checking on him, sitting with him when I'm inside. I know why you're doing it, and I know you'd do it even if—" She stopped, started again. "I want you to know that I see it, and that it matters." He was quiet for a moment. His breath came out white in the cold air. "He's a good man," Silas said. "And he loves you badly and doesn't know how to say it in the right amount of words." "No," she said. "He doesn't. So I figure the roof is the version of saying it that he'd do himself, if he could get up there." He looked at the track. "I'm just doing it for him." She stopped walking. He took 2 more steps before he realized and turned around to look at her. She was standing in the snow looking at him with an expression she wasn't trying to control. "What?" he said. "Nothing," she said. "Come on, it's cold. She started walking again past him, and he fell into step beside her, and he didn't ask again, and she didn't explain because some things you just have to hold for a while before they become words. February deepened, and the trap lines became in their own way the structure of the days. Clara had started going with him. Not every day. Some days the conditions or the distance made it impractical, and some days she had things in the cabin that needed doing, but regularly enough that she'd learned the line's logic, the sequence of sets, and the reasoning behind each placement. He explained it the way he explained most things, straightforwardly, assuming she could follow, not checking to see if she'd gotten lost. She hadn't gotten lost. "Here," he'd say, stopping beside a set of tracks in the snow, and she'd look at the pattern and he'd say, "What do you see?" And at first she'd describe the surface of it. Tracks, 2 sets, the smaller ones going right. And he'd nod and add the layer below. What the tracks said about the animal's speed, its intention, whether it was running from something or moving toward something, how recently it had passed. Over the course of February, without formal instruction, she learned to read 2 layers herself. Silas would stop and she would look and say what she saw, and he would either nod or add something, and the adding something grew less frequent as the weeks went on. One morning she spotted a set of tracks he'd almost passed. "Wait," she said. He stopped. She pointed at a depression in the snow beside a fallen log, half obscured by the overhang of a snow-bent branch. "That's not from last night." He looked where she was pointing, crouched down, was quiet for a moment. "This morning," he said, "before sunrise." He looked up at her. "How did you see that?" "The shadow was wrong," she said. "The snow around it is flatter, like it sat down and then moved on." He looked at her in the way he had when something genuinely caught him off guard. Not surprise on the surface, but something shifting underneath it. He stood up. "Yes," he said, "that's it exactly." She had learned by February to take his approval in its actual size, not to make it smaller because she was uncomfortable with it, not to make it larger because she needed it, just to take it as what it was, a plain assessment from a man who didn't offer plain assessments unless they were earned. She took it. She kept walking. That evening, making dinner, she was aware of him watching her from his chair in the way he sometimes did when he thought she wasn't looking, and she said, without turning around, "You're going to have to stop acting like I'm going to surprise you. I've been surprising you for 4 months." A pause. "I'm not acting like anything." "Silas, I'm just watching." "I know you are." "Oh." She turned around. He was, in fact, watching, with the quiet, focused expression she knew now as distinctly his, not intensity for its own sake, but genuine attention, the kind he gave to trap sets and weather patterns and everything else he took seriously. "What are you thinking?" she said. He was quiet a moment. "I'm thinking," he said, "that I was right." "About what?" "About you," he said. "About what you'd be, given enough time." She looked at him across the kitchen. "What am I?" she said. "Exactly what I thought," he said, "and more than I expected, both at once." She turned back to the stove because if she stood there looking at him any longer, she was going to have to say something that required more courage than she currently had ready, and she'd rather have that conversation when she'd had time to build up to it properly. She stirred the pot and let the warmth of the stove do something about the warmth rising in her face. "Dinner in 20 minutes, she said. "All right," he said, and she could hear without looking that he was still watching her, and that he was doing something she'd only recently learned to identify in him. He was almost smiling. It was a Wednesday in the middle of February when the conversation finally happened. Not the one she'd been circling for weeks, that one came later, but the one about his father, which turned out to be the one she'd needed to understand first. They'd had a long day. The trap line, then a downed section of fence on the east side of the claim that had given way under the snow load, which they'd repaired in the brutal wind with fingers that stopped working properly around the third wire. By the time they got in and thawed out, it was evening and they were the particular tired that comes from cold physical work, clean and deep, the kind that makes food taste better and silence feel earned. After dinner, he sat at the table with his coffee, and she sat across from him, and at some point, with the fire going and the wind outside testing the north wall, she said, "Tell me about him. Your father." He looked at her over his cup. "What about him?" "Whatever you want to tell." He considered that. Then he set his cup down and looked at it. He was a harder man than I am, he said. Not cruel, just he didn't have a lot of patience for softness. He'd had a hard time of it before Montana, before trapping, things he didn't talk about. It made him practical in a way that didn't leave much room for anything else. Did he love you? In his way, Silas said. He showed me everything he knew, every skill he had. He thought that was love, and maybe it was. I didn't have another version to compare it to. Clara looked at his hands on the table. Big, capable hands, scarred in the places working hands get scarred. Was it lonely? She said. Growing up like that? Sometimes, he said, the same word he'd used months ago for the winters alone, and with the same flat honesty. I learned to not need much, which I used to think was the same as being fine. He picked up his cup. I'm not sure I still think that. What changed? He looked at her. Not the steady measuring look, something more direct than that. You know what changed, he said. She held his eyes. Say it, she said. A silence. The stove ticked. Outside the wind was doing its sustained, patient thing against the walls. You changed it, he said. Being here. The way you... He stopped. Tried again. I built this cabin for one person, and I knew that, and I told myself it was enough. And then you came and you reorganized the storeroom in the first week, and fixed the weather stripping yourself and argued with me about snowshoes and went to a stranger's birthing at midnight without being asked, and I thought... He shook his head slightly. I thought I'd been wrong about what enough meant. Clara was very still. Silas, she said. I'm not done, he said. She closed her mouth. I know this isn't what you'd have chosen, he said. I know October was... I know how it felt to you, the arrangement, the way it was done. I knew it then, and I know it now. And I want you to know that if you had come up here and been miserable and wanted out by December, I would have found a way to make that happen without... He stopped. His jaw tightened slightly. I wasn't going to hold you somewhere you didn't want to be. That was never what I wanted. I know that, she said. But you're not miserable, he said. And I'm... He looked at the table. I'm grateful for that in a way I don't have clean words for. She looked at him for a long moment, at the careful, honest shape of a man who had spent his whole life economizing with words, because he'd never been sure they'd be received, sitting across from her trying to use them anyway. Silas, she said, look at me. He looked at her. I'm not here because I have nowhere else to be, she said. I stopped being here for that reason a long time ago. She put her hands flat on the table. I'm here because you are the most honest person I have ever known, and you make me want to be braver than I am, and I am... She stopped. I am very glad my father is a stubborn man who didn't take no for an answer. Something happened in his face. Something that had been held for a long time found, finally, that it didn't have to be held anymore. Yeah, he said quietly. So am I. She reached across the table, put her hand over his. We don't have to call it anything yet, she said. We don't have to make a thing of it tonight. All right, he said. But I want you to know, she said. That's all. I just wanted you to know. His hand turned under hers and held it. Outside the wind dropped briefly, the way it sometimes did in the middle of a cold night. A sudden hush, like the world pausing between one thing and the next. Then it came back, and the stove ticked, and they sat at the table holding hands in the way of people who have said something real and are still learning the shape of it, and neither of them moved for a long time. March arrived with the indifference of seasons that don't care what you need from them. The cold didn't break. Everyone had known it wouldn't break, but knowing something and living through it are different things. And the first week of March brought 3 days of new snow that had Clara staring at the white-loaded pine boughs outside the window with the particular expression of someone who has reached the end of their goodwill toward a season. It'll turn, Silas said, coming in from the barn. You say that like I don't know it. You look like you've forgotten. I haven't forgotten. I'm just... She turned from the window. I want to see the ground. 2 weeks, he said. Maybe 3. You don't know that. I've been here 4 winters, he said. It turns in the last week of March. Might be a few days either side, but if you say the mountain has a pattern, I'm going to throw something. He paused, boot in hand. I was going to say experience suggests, he said, but noted, She almost laughed. Almost. The snow from those 3 days ended up being a kind of gift, perversely, because it kept them in, and the keeping in meant time. Long evenings at the table with the lamps going. He had started a second set of books for the claim, recording the trapline yields, the timber measurements on the north section, the survey marks he'd been updating since autumn. And she'd gotten into the habit of reading over his shoulder when he worked on them, asking questions that he answered with the same patient completeness he brought to explaining the trapline. "What's this?" she said one evening, pointing to a notation in the margin of the survey page. "Water rights," he said. "The creek on the east side. There was a question about it last year. Hennessy again, before he left. He'd been claiming the creek ran through his land, but the survey put the line south of it." He tapped the notation. "I had Warren Caulfield rewalk it in August. This is his signature. The creek is ours." She looked at the page. "You kept the signature. Always keep the document," he said. "People's memories are convenient. Paper isn't." She looked at the notation for a moment, and then she looked at the shelves where his other records were kept. The careful, consistent handwriting filling ledger after ledger. The dates and measurements and agreements. The entire architecture of a claim built and defended through documentation. "Your father taught you this?" she said. "My father kept everything in his head," Silas said. "Lost a section of land because of it. A man came through with a piece of paper that said different from what my father remembered. And paper won." He looked at the ledger. Lesson learned. She thought about that. About the way certain lessons travel. Not through being told, but through loss. The things you know in your bones, you know, because something else was in those bones first and it broke. "I want to learn to read these properly," she said. "The survey documents." He looked at her. "Why?" She met his eyes. "Because this is my land too." A pause. Something changed in his expression. Not surprise, not quite, but a recognition of something he'd hoped for and not assumed. "Yes," he said. "It is." He turned the ledger toward her and started from the beginning, and she pulled her chair close, and they spent the next 2 hours going through it together, his handwriting and her questions, and the lamp burning warm between them. Somewhere in the second week of March, they found a way to fight. It was bound to happen. Clara had known that. Known it the way you know that cold fronts eventually meet warm ones, and what happens between them is unavoidable. Two people in a small space with strong opinions and a winter's worth of accumulated patience cannot sustain that patience indefinitely. Something was going to give, and in the end it gave over something that was not, in retrospect, worth the pitch it reached, which was also inevitable. It started over the north fence. Silas had a plan for repairing it come spring, a specific plan with timber he'd already cut and set aside and a sequence of posts he'd worked out. Claire had a different idea about the line of it, having spent the winter looking at the way the snow drifted against the current fence and understanding that the drift pattern meant the line was in the wrong place by about 8 feet, putting the worst of the load directly on the weakest posts. She brought it up at dinner. He disagreed, politely, reasonably, with the steady tone of a man who had been building fence lines for 15 years and had thought about this particular one already. She disagreed with his disagreement. They went back and forth on it, still reasonably, for about 10 minutes, and then it stopped being about the fence. "I'm not saying your plan is wrong," she said. "I'm saying the drift pattern argues for moving the line." "I've seen drift patterns before." "On this fence? This winter?" "Clara, because I've been looking at this particular fence from this particular window for 4 months, and I know what the snow does against it, and I'm telling you the middle posts take more than the others by a significant amount." "I understand what you're saying," he said, with the patience of someone trying to demonstrate patience, which was different from actually having it. "I'm telling you the placement was deliberate. The survey line runs there, and I need the fence on the survey line. Then reinforce the middle posts. That's more timber. Then use more timber." "Clara," his jaw had tightened. "I've built 4 fence lines on this property. I think I understand how, and I've watched this one all winter," she said, "which you haven't because you've been on the trap line. So between your 4 previous fence lines and my 4 months of watching this specific fence, maybe we could just—" She stopped, took a breath. "Maybe we could just go look at it together before you've decided." Silence. He looked at her. She looked at him. "Fine," he said. "Fine," she said. They went out in their coats in the cold, and walked to the north fence and stood there in the thin March light and looked at it. He looked at the posts. She looked at the drift pattern still visible in the settled snow. Neither of them said anything for a minute. Then he crouched down beside the middle post and looked at the base of it. He stood up. "You're right," he said. "The drift load has stressed this one." She said nothing. "I should have walked the fence before now," he said. Not apologizing exactly, just acknowledging, which was its own thing. "You've been busy," she said. "That's not a reason," he said. She looked at him. The cold air between them, the pale sky, the fence with its stressed middle post. "You're not easy to disagree with," she said. He looked at her with something that might have been wry. "Neither are you." "I know," she said. "I come by it honestly." "From Edmund." "From Edmund." He looked at the fence again. "We'll move the line 3 feet south of the post and reinforce the new middle supports. That puts us off the survey line, but not by enough to matter, and it solves the drift problem." "That works," she said. "It was a good catch," he said. "The drift pattern." "Thank you for saying so." They walked back to the cabin and they didn't speak much for the rest of the afternoon, but it was a recovering silence, not a wounded one, and by evening it had resolved into the ordinary texture of their shared life, and she thought, "We fight like people who plan to still be here after the fight." That was something she hadn't known she needed until she had it. Paul. Edmund's letter came through with a neighbor heading north in the 3rd week of March, folded twice and slightly damp at one corner from the ride. She read it at the table while Silas was in the barn. Her father's handwriting had always been precise, the handwriting of a man who'd had some schooling and taken pride in it, and reading it now she could see where the precision had softened. Not badly, not yet, but enough that she noticed. He wrote about the winter, about Morton Vance, who had apparently become something of a regular at the Harmon table, which Edmund seemed pleased about the fence dispute that had finally been resolved with the other family buying off the contested section, about a letter he'd gotten from his sister in Ohio, which he hadn't heard from in years. Near the end he wrote, "I have been thinking about the spring, about what I hope it brings. I think you know. I hope you'll forgive an old man for hoping." She sat with that for a while. When Silas came in, she was still at the table, the letter in her hands. "Your father?" he said, reading her face. "He's all right," she said. He's hoping." "For what?" She looked up at him. "For us," she said. "To make it real." Silas was still for a moment. "Isn't it real?" he said. "It's real to me," she said. "I think what he means is," she looked at the letter. "He means formal. Before—" She didn't finish the sentence. He understood. Before Edmund ran out of time to see it, he came and sat down across from her. He didn't rush into the silence. "What do you want?" he said. Just that. Not what does your father want, not what makes sense. What do you want? She looked at him, at the face she'd been looking at since October, that she knew now the way you know the landscape you move through every day, not just its features, but its weather, the way it changed with different lights, the places it was solid, and the places it gave way. "I want it to be my choice," she said, "not because it has to be, because it actually is." "And is it?" he said. "Yes," she said, "it is." He held her eyes for a moment. Then he nodded. The small nod she knew meant he'd taken something in fully and filed it somewhere it would stay. "Then tell me what you want the spring to look like," he said, "and we'll build toward it." She exhaled. She picked up her father's letter and read him the parts worth reading, and he listened, and then they talked about the spring. Not in the abstract, but specifically the way they'd learned to talk about hard things, directly, practically, without dressing it up in more than it needed. The fence, first. This cabin's south wall that needed re-caulking. The garden she wanted to start. A real one. Not just the small patch he'd kept for root vegetables, but something that would feed them through a winter without depleting the stores as badly as this one had. The trip down to the settlement once the road cleared. Her father. They talked until the lamp burned low and the fire needed banking, and by the time they moved to do those things, the spring felt less like something that might come and more like something they were already moving toward, together, with their eyes open, which was the only way Clara Boone had ever wanted to move toward anything. The last days of March came with the smell of it, that particular thaw smell, mud and pine, and the cold giving up one layer at a time. The snow on the south-facing eaves began to drip by noon and freeze again by dark, that daily cycle of melt and refreeze that was winter's last way of reminding you it wasn't done. But the change was real. The trapline was producing differently. The animals moving, ranging, the patterns of the land shifting the way they shifted when the season turned its face. The horses were restless in a different way than February's restless, not anxious, but eager, tossing their heads when she led them out to the yard, reading the air with their wide nostrils. One evening, Silas came in from the line and stood on the porch and said, 2 weeks. She came to the door. He was looking south, where the track ran down toward the settlement, and the light was long and gold on the ridge. Maybe less, he said. She stood in the doorway. The air was cold, but not the killing cold, the kind that bit and let go, the kind that carried underneath it the suggestion of something warmer. I want to go down when it opens, she said. See my father. I know, he said. We'll go. She leaned against the doorframe and looked at the same ridge he was looking at. Silas, she said. He turned. When we go down, she said, I want to do it right. The ceremony, properly. She met his eyes. I want to stand up in front of everyone and choose you out loud. He was very still. You already married me, he said. I know, she said. I want to do it again, knowing what I know now. She held his gaze. Is that something you'd want? He looked at her for a long moment with an expression she had no prior version of to compare to. Open and serious, and something she could only call full, like a man who'd been rationing something for so long that being told he didn't have to anymore hadn't quite landed yet. Yes, he said, simply, without qualification. She nodded. They stood on the porch in the long March evening, the snow dripping from the eaves, the horses moving in the barn, the ridge going pink and then amber, and then the quiet gray of last light, and neither of them said anything else for a while. They didn't need to. The winter was ending. The life they'd built inside it, imperfect, hard-won, honest, was not ending with it. It was doing the thing that things do when the season changes and the conditions they were built under lift. It was showing, finally, what it was made of. And what it was made of was enough to stand in the light. The road opened on the 28th of March. Not all at once. Roads in the mountains don't open the way doors open, with a clean before and after. They open the way conviction opens, gradually, in sections, one stretch surrendering to thaw, while another holds, until one morning you walk the whole length of it and realize that what had been impassable has become, without ceremony, passable. Silas walked it that morning and came back and said, tomorrow. And Clara was already thinking about what to pack. She hadn't slept well the night before. Not because anything was wrong. Nothing was wrong, which was in itself a thing she was still adjusting to, the unfamiliar weight of things going right, but because the end of winter had a particular quality of anticipation that her body registered even when her mind tried to stay practical. The season was changing. Her father was down there. The settlement was down there. The spring was coming up through the mud and the dead grass and the bare branches, and something about all of it pressed against the inside of her chest in a way that made sleep difficult. She got up before light and made bread. Not because anyone needed bread specifically, but because her hands needed something to do, and bread was the thing her hands knew best when the rest of her was working through something. She'd made it in the dark many times now. She didn't need to see what she was doing. Silas got up at first light and found her at the table with a finished loaf cooling and a second one in the pan, and he looked at both and looked at her and said, How long have you been up? A while, she said. Did you sleep? Some. He poured coffee and sat down across from her and didn't ask any more questions, which was the right call. I keep thinking about what I want to say to him, she said after a while. To your father? Yes. She looked at the loaf. I keep thinking there are things I should have said by now, in letters, that I didn't say because I didn't know them yet, or because I was, I don't know, being careful. You can say them tomorrow, he said. What if I don't know how? Then say that, he said. Edmund's not a man who needs polished sentences. She looked at her hands on the table. No, he's not. He just needs to see your face, Silas said. That'll do more than anything you could say. She looked up at him. He was watching her with the quiet, complete attention she'd come to rely on in the way you rely on things that hold. Not because they've been tested once and passed, but because they've been tested continuously, the way a good beam is tested by the roof that rests on it every day. "All right," she said. "All right," he agreed, and drank his coffee. They left at mid-morning, the wagon loaded with the bread and a parcel of things she'd been putting aside for her father. Dried venison, 2 jars of preserves, the extra wool she'd made into a blanket over the winter, which had turned out better than she'd expected, even with the imperfect edge at one corner that she'd failed to fix evenly. She brought it anyway. Imperfect edges were still warm. The road was soft in places where the thaw had worked down through the packed snow to the mud beneath, and the horses picked their way with the cautious authority of animals who understood footing. Silas drove, and she sat beside him, and the valley was doing the thing it always did at the end of winter, coming back to itself in pieces, the south-facing hillsides already showing patches of bare ground and the first tentative brown of exposed grass, the creek running high and quick and loud, the trees still bare but beginning to show the faint reddening of buds. That meant the decision had been made at the cellular level, even if the evidence wasn't there yet. "Look," she said at one point. He looked where she was pointing, a stand of aspens on the east side, and in the bare branches, 3 or 4 birds moving, the first she'd seen since November. He said nothing, but she saw the corner of his mouth move. She faced forward and let the road carry them south, toward the settlement, toward her father, toward whatever spring was going to make of them. Edmund Ashford's house was smaller than she remembered. She knew that wasn't true. Houses didn't shrink, and she'd been here in January, and it had been the same size then. But there was something about coming back to a place after an interior change of sufficient scale that made the physical world around it seem to have adjusted, like looking at an old photograph and noticing how small everything is in it. She had become someone different in that cabin on the North Road, and the house she'd grown up in now occupied the position in her life of a beloved, familiar, slightly too small thing. She was off the wagon before it fully stopped and on the porch, and knocking before she'd thought about whether to knock, which was how she knew she'd come home rather than arrived somewhere. The door opened, and it was her father, standing there in his indoor clothes, thinner than January, the shaking in his left hand more visible in the daylight. But his eyes were the same, sharp and dark, and full of the particular scene of a man who has spent his life paying attention. He looked at her. "You look different," he said. "I'm the same," she said. "No," he said. "You're not." He said it with something in his voice that wasn't grief, but wasn't simple gladness either. It was the complicated feeling of a parent watching a child become themselves, which is what you wanted and what you lost at the same time. "Come in. Come in, both of you." Silas had the horses at the post and came up the porch and shook Edmund's hand, and Edmund held the handshake a beat longer than usual, looking at him in the way of a man making an assessment he's been waiting months to make. "You look well," Edmund said. "Winter was good to us," Silas said. Edmund's eyes moved to Clara and back. "I can see that." Inside, the house was warmer than January. Someone had been coming by to help with the wood. She found out later it was the Harmon boy, who'd apparently taken it on himself over the winter without being asked, which was the kind of thing the Harmon family did. She put the kettle on and unpacked the parcel while Edmund and Silas sat at the table, and she listened to them talk. She listened and she cooked and she moved around the kitchen she'd grown up in, and somewhere between the kettle coming to boil and the bread sliced on the board, she understood something she hadn't quite understood before. This house had made her in the way that places make people. The cold mornings, the early rising, the years of managing what needed managing without anyone telling her she was doing something worth doing. She had learned her own competence here. She had learned that things don't get done unless you do them, and that doing them is its own reward, because the alternative is watching them not get done, which is worse. Her mother had taught her that. This kitchen had taught her that. And Silas Boone had been the first person in her adult life to see that that was not a limitation but a character, and to treat it accordingly. She put the bread on the table and sat down with them, and her father looked at the bread and then at her, and she said, "I made it this morning. I couldn't sleep." And he said, "Your mother used to do the same thing." And she said, "I know, Papa. I know." They ate. They talked. Outside, the spring light moved across the settlement in the way of March light, bright but thin, not yet committed, just making the argument that warmth was possible. After a while, Edmund looked at the table and said, without preamble, "So, the spring." Clara looked at Silas. Silas looked at her, ceding the answer. "We want to do it properly," she said. "A ceremony. Here." She looked at her father. "Before, while you can." Edmund was quiet. "It was always proper," he said. "Legally." "I know," she said. "I want it to be mine. I want to stand up and say yes and have it be because I chose it." Edmund looked at her for a long moment. His throat moved. "When?" he said. "When the settlement's ready," she said. "Give it a week. Let the road settle. Let people know." She paused. "I want Ruth Garrett there, and Mort Vance, and the Harmons." "Mary Garrett will want to bring the baby," her father said. "Good," she said. "Let her bring the baby." Edmund looked at Silas. Something passed between the two men that Clara couldn't fully read. Something old and finished and also somehow new in it, the closing of an account and the opening of something else. "Thank you," Edmund said, "for bringing her back to herself." "She didn't need me for that," Silas said. "She did that herself. I just stayed out of the way." Edmund smiled. It was the first real smile she'd seen on him in months. "Stay for supper," he said. They stayed for supper. The next week was the most activity the settlement had seen since the autumn gathering, which was saying something for a community whose idea of excitement was a well-attended fence dispute. Word moved the way word always moved in a settlement, fast, laterally, and with additions that weren't in the original. By the second day, Clara was told, some version of the story had acquired a dramatic winter rescue and a rivalry, neither of which had happened. But she declined to correct them because the true version was in some ways harder to explain than the invented one. The true version didn't have a clear dramatic turn. It had a series of ordinary days that accumulated into something that felt, by the end, extraordinary. That's harder to tell at a trading post. People wanted the rescue. Ruth Garrett came by on the second day, ostensibly to help with preparations, and actually to see for herself what winter had done to Clara Ashford. And she arrived and stood in Edmund's kitchen and looked at Clara for a long moment, and then said, "Well, I was right." "About what?" Clara said. "I knew you'd come to it," Ruth said. "Some women need someone to tell them what they're worth. You needed someone to just stand there and be worth something themselves, so you could see it reflected." She poured herself coffee without being invited, which was entirely Ruth. "Did I ever tell you what I heard him say about you? Last summer, before any of this?" "At the trading post," Clara said. "He said I was worth knowing." Ruth looked at her. "That's what Edmund told you. What I heard him say, I was behind the supply counter. He didn't know I was there. What he said was, that woman is going to be extraordinary if anyone ever gives her enough room." She sipped her coffee. "I thought about telling you at the time. I decided it would mean more later." She set her cup down. "Was I right?" Clara looked at her. "You were right," she said. Ruth picked her cup back up with the satisfied expression of a woman who had known it all along. Mort Vance came by to see Claire on the Thursday before the ceremony. He came alone, on foot, which was farther than she'd known him to walk in some time, and he stood at Edmund's door in his good coat, the one he'd worn at the trading post in better weather, brushed and buttoned. And when she opened the door, he said, "I wanted to bring you something," and held out a small tin. She took it. It was Bess's recipe tin. She could tell from the wear on it, the particular dents that came from years of handling. "Mort," she said. "There's a bread in there," he said, "from her mother's people, further east. I don't know if it's something you'd want, but Bess always said bread was the right thing for a beginning." He looked at the tin. "She would have wanted to give it to you herself. She liked you, even from just the few times she saw you." Clara held the tin in both hands. "Come in," she said. "Sit down. Have coffee." "I don't want to impose." "Mort," she said. "Come in." He came in. He sat down. He had his coffee, and he talked about Bess, the bread, the recipe, the way she'd come to Montana when it was still the kind of territory that tried to kill you and had decided to love it anyway. Clara listened to all of it and asked questions and let him talk. And when he was done, there was a silence of the good kind, the kind that doesn't need filling. She would have liked him, Mort said, meaning Silas. Bess always said she could tell a man's character by how he treated things he didn't have to treat well. Horses, mostly. Other people's horses, especially. He looked at his cup. She watched him at the autumn gathering. This was the year before last. And she said to me, "That man is quieter than he needs to be." Said it like it was a compliment. He smiled, small and private. She was usually right about people. She sounds like she was, Clara said. She was the smartest person I knew, he said, simply. I don't say that to be sentimental. I say it because it's true, and I don't see any reason to not say true things. She looked at the recipe tin on the table. I'll use the bread recipe, she said, for the gathering. He nodded. She'd like that. But the morning of the ceremony was overcast, which Clara thought was appropriate. Not in a foreboding way, just in the honest way of spring weather in the mountains, which makes no promises about what it's going to do and doesn't apologize for the uncertainty. By 10 o'clock, there was pale sun coming through in patches, the light moving across the settlement in the uneven way of a cloudy spring morning, here and then gone, and then back again. She dressed in her own bedroom, in her father's house, for the last time as a woman who technically lived there. She'd brought a dress from the cabin, not her mother's blue one, which she'd worn in October. A different one. A green one she'd made herself over the winter, in the evenings by the stove, from fabric she'd found in the settlement's dry goods, and been unable to stop thinking about. It was plain. It fit well. The sleeves were the right length, and the hem was even, and there was a place at the cuff where she'd run out of thread, and had to finish with a slightly different color that you could see if you were looking for it. She wasn't going to hide the cuff. She stood at the mirror and looked at herself. The woman looking back at her was the same woman who had stood at this mirror in October with cold hands and a mended dress and the specific expression of someone being sent somewhere against their will. She was the same woman, and she was also not. She'd learned things in the cabin that you couldn't learn anywhere else, about herself specifically, which was the only kind of learning that changed who you were rather than just what you knew. She'd learned that she was stronger than she'd been told, and more afraid than she'd admitted, and more capable of being moved by simple goodness than she'd believed, because she'd spent her life in an environment where simple goodness wasn't always available to be moved by. She'd learned that trust was not a feeling but a practice. You didn't feel trust and then act on it. You acted trusting, and the feeling followed slowly, the way warmth followed when you stayed near a good fire long enough. She'd learned that the right person didn't complete you or save you or make you more than you were. The right person paid attention. The right person showed up and kept showing up and did the thing that needed doing and stayed quiet when quiet was what the moment required and spoke when the speaking mattered. And over time, the showing up and the doing and the staying and the speaking accumulated into something you could rely on, and the relying was its own kind of love, the deep kind. The kind that didn't depend on circumstances. She'd also learned that she was still learning all of this, that she would keep learning it, that it was not the kind of knowledge you arrived at and then possessed. It was the kind you practiced continuously, and the practicing itself was most of the point. Her father knocked on the door. "Clara, girl," he said, "it's time." "I know," she said. "I'm ready." Moshat. The meeting house held everyone. Not everyone from the settlement. There were people who couldn't make it, who were too far out or too occupied with the spring work that didn't wait for ceremonies. But everyone who mattered was there, and the room had the warm, slightly crowded feeling of people gathered for something real. Ruth Garrett was in the front row with her arms folded and an expression of imminent satisfaction. The Harmons were there in force, all 5 of them, and Mary with the baby, who was asleep in her arms with the breathtaking completeness of a 4-month-old who had no opinion about ceremonies. Mort Vance was there in his good coat, and he nodded at Clara when she came in, and she nodded back, and that was enough. Douglas Cray was there too, with his brother Mac. She hadn't expected that. He looked at her when she came in, and then looked away, and she saw on his face the specific expression of a man who has revised something and is still in the process of making peace with the revision. She felt no particular triumph about it. She just noted it and moved past. Warren Caulfield was at the front, in the same position he'd occupied in October, with the same businesslike manner, though he'd combed his hair better for this one. And Silas was there. He was standing at the front of the room in the same dark coat as October, the one that didn't quite fit across the shoulders, and his hair was combed and his face was the face she'd spent a winter learning. And when she came through the door, he looked at her the way he always looked at her, with complete attention, nothing performed. She walked toward him. The room was not quiet in the way of hushed ceremony. There was the baby sighing and someone coughing, and the particular creak of the meeting house floor that had been there since it was built. It was a room full of people who had their own lives happening alongside this moment, which was how it should be. Nothing about this was going to be a performance. There wasn't a bone in either of them built for performing. She stopped beside him. "You look good," he said, low enough that only she could hear. "So do you," she said. "Your coat still doesn't fit." "I know," he said. "I've been meaning to get another one." "I'll make you one," she said. "This winter." He looked at her. "That a promise?" "That's a promise," she said. Warren Caulfield cleared his throat. They both looked forward. The words were the same words as October, or near enough. The plain legal shape of a commitment, stripped of excess. Warren was not a man for decoration. Clara appreciated that. She had stood here once already in a different version of herself and said yes to a question she hadn't fully understood, and now she was standing here again to say yes to the same question that she understood completely, and the difference between those two yeses was the entire winter and everything in it. When Warren got to the part about consent, he looked at her. "Clara, he started. "Yes," she said, before he finished, clear and direct and without hesitation. Something moved through the room. Not noise, exactly. More like a shift in the quality of the air, the way the air shifts when everyone in a room simultaneously relaxes. Silas said yes, and his voice was even, the way it was when he meant something absolutely. Warren pronounced them married, and this time the applause was not the polite kind. Ruth Garrett started it, and the Harmons joined, and the baby woke up and contributed a surprised, high-pitched sound that made the nearest people laugh, and Mort Vance clapped with the particular enthusiasm of a man who needed something to celebrate and had waited long enough for it. Silas turned to her. She put her hand on the bad-fitting coat and looked up at him, and he looked down at her, and for a moment it was just them. All the noise and the people and the spring light coming through the dusty windows, and just them inside it, which was how it had felt all winter, really. A small circle of warmth inside a large and indifferent cold. He kissed her, briefly, decently, and she heard Ruth make a sound of approval that was really more of a verdict. "Mrs. Boone," he said. "Mr. Boone," she said. "Shall we go find your father?" She looked around and found Edmund in the back of the room, standing. He'd refused a chair, she could tell, and he was going to pay for it later, but she understood why. He was standing, straight as he could manage, watching her with the face of a man who had made the best decision of his life by accident and knew it. She went to him. She put both arms around him, and he held on with more strength than she'd expected, and she pressed her face against his shoulder and said quietly, into the fabric of his coat, "I'm not angry, Papa. I haven't been for a long time. I just needed you to know that." She felt his breath go out of him. A long, slow release. "I know," he said against her hair. "I know, Clara girl." They stood there for a moment in the noise of the room. "Was I right?" he said. "About him." She stepped back and looked at her father's worn, familiar, beloved face. "You were right," she said. "Don't let it go to your head." He laughed. He actually laughed. The real one. The one that went all the way to his eyes. And she thought she would carry that laugh with her for the rest of her life. The gathering afterward was the kind that happens when people are genuinely glad and don't feel the need to manage it. Tables outside, in the pale spring sun that had committed more fully as the morning went on. Food from everywhere. The bread Clara had made from Bess Vance's recipe, which had come out dense and seed-spotted and very good, better than she'd expected. Ruth Garrett's contribution, which was 3 pies and a pot of something that smelled like autumn. The Harmon family's preserved things. Enough food for twice the people present, because that was what a settlement did when it was grateful for an occasion to feed itself. Clara moved through it and talked to people and ate more than she'd expected and felt, the whole time, the odd and pleasant sense of being exactly where she was supposed to be. Not because destiny had arranged it, which was not a thing she believed in, but because she'd worked toward this, step by step, through a winter that had asked everything of her and had been, in its grinding, relentless way, the best education she'd ever received. Silas stayed close without hovering. She'd notice him across the gathering, and he'd be talking to someone, Mort Vance, or one of the Harmon men, or Edmund, who'd accepted a chair and a plate and was holding court in the afternoon sun with the contentment of a man who had everything he'd wanted. And then she'd look again a few minutes later, and he'd be somewhere else. But she always knew where, and she thought that was its own kind of extraordinary. To know where someone was without checking. To carry a person's location as a piece of information your body maintained without effort. She was talking to Mary Garrett about the baby, who had enormous opinions about being held by multiple strangers in sequence, and was not keeping them to himself, when Ruth appeared beside her. "All right," Ruth said. "I'm going to say it, and then I'm going to never say it again." Clara waited. "I knew," Ruth said, "from October. I told Bess Vance in October that you two were going to be fine, and she said she hoped so, and I said I knew so." She looked across the gathering at Silas. "He looked at you different from the day of the wedding. Not how men usually look at a new wife, which is generally some mix of pleased with themselves and nervous. He looked at you like you were a problem he'd been given and was genuinely interested in solving." "That's the most romantic thing you've ever said to me," Clara said. "I don't do romantic," Ruth said. "I do accurate." She looked at Clara. "Are you happy?" Clara thought about it. For the second time, someone had asked her that this week. "Yes," she said, and this time she didn't qualify it. Ruth nodded. "Good," and moved on to refill her plate, because Ruth Garrett had said what she came to say and was done. Well, they drove home in the late afternoon. The road was still soft in places, and the horses moved carefully, and the light came down long and gold through the budding aspens, the kind of light that exists only in the hour before evening in early spring. Not warm enough to keep you long, but warm enough to mean it for a while. Clara sat beside him with her shoulder against his arm and watched the valley go by. "Your father looked better," Silas said. "He looked tired," she said. "Yes, but good tired, the kind that comes from a day that was worth it." She thought about her father's face when he'd laughed. "Yes, that's it exactly." The horses moved on and the road unwound, and the valley held them in the particular way of spring valleys. Everything still bare, still cold at the edges, still marked by winter, but the marking felt different now. Not damage, evidence. Proof that something had been through the worst of what the season could do and had come out the other side with its structure intact. "What are you thinking?" he said. "I'm thinking about what Ruth said, that you looked at me different from October." "Did she say what different meant?" "Like I was a problem you were genuinely interested in solving." He was quiet for a moment. "That's not wrong," he said. She looked at him. "That's not especially romantic." "No," he agreed, "but it's honest." She laughed. The real laugh. The full one. The one that came from somewhere below where she usually let things come from. She hadn't laughed like that in front of very many people in her life. She was laughing like that in front of him now, and it didn't feel like exposure. It felt like the opposite of exposure. It felt like being somewhere that was actually safe, which was different from being somewhere that felt safe, and she was only now learning to tell the two apart. "Silas?" she said when she'd stopped. "I've been thinking about the north pasture for the garden." "I thought the east side." "The east side gets shade from the ridge after noon. North pasture gets light all day." He considered this. "Soil's different on the north side." "We'll work the soil," she said. "It'll take a season to build it up, but by next summer, it'll be better for it." He was quiet for a moment. She could see him thinking it through, not looking for reasons to say no, but actually considering the variables. That was the thing she'd come to rely on. He was worth arguing with because he actually listened, and when you were right, he said so. And when you were wrong, he said that too, and the conversation that happened between those two things was usually where the right answer lived. "All right," he said. "North pasture." "You're agreeing too fast," she said. "You're going to second-guess it when we're turning the soil." "I might," he said. "I'll deal with it then." She looked at the road. "That's how you do everything, isn't it?" she said. "Deal with it when it comes." "More or less." "I'm the opposite," she said. I plan everything. I think about everything that could go wrong, and I plan for it. I know, he said. Is that difficult to live with? He glanced at her. Is it difficult to live with someone who doesn't plan? Sometimes, she said honestly. Sometimes, he said, equally honest. She looked at the aspens. We work well together, though. Yes, he said. We do. The fence, she said. The north pasture. The trap line. The storeroom, he said. The weather stripping. The Garrett baby at midnight. Morton Vance, he said. The parcels. She smiled, looking at the road. All those moments, small and real, adding up to something neither of them had been looking for, and both of them had, somehow, been ready for when it arrived. There. They pulled into the yard as the last of the direct light left the ridge, and the sky went the clear, deep blue of an early spring evening. The horses needed tending, and the stove needed starting, and the cabin needed the 100 small attentions that a cabin requires, and they did all of it the way they always did. Not efficiently, not seamlessly, but with the practiced cooperation of two people who know each other's habits well enough to move around them. She started the fire and he took care of the horses, and then he came in and she had the lamp going and something on the stove, and they sat down to eat in the cabin they'd spent a winter building a life inside of. And the cabin was the same as it had always been. The same floor, the same walls, the same stove making the same sounds. And it was also, in the way that things are changed by what happens inside them, entirely different. After dinner, she sat at the table with Bess Vance's recipe tin and looked through the cards inside. Most were in Bess's handwriting, round and careful, the handwriting of a woman who had cared about getting things right, and some had notes in the margins, alterations made over years of cooking, the record of a life carried in flour measurements and the temperature of water, and the particular insight that this bread needs 10 more minutes than it seems to. Silas sat across from her and watched her go through them. She kept all of them, Clara said. People keep what matters, he said. She looked at a card near the bottom, a soup recipe with a note in the margin. Add more salt than you think. W always says less, but he's wrong. She smiled. W, she said. Must be Mort. Has to be, he said. She thought about Mort Vance and Bess Vance arguing over salt in a kitchen somewhere, over the course of however many winters they'd had together, and the fact that Bess had documented it in the margin of a recipe card as evidence, and the fact that Mort was still here without her and was slowly, carefully, choosing to remain in the world, and she thought about what that cost and what it proved. What it proved was something she was still learning to name. Something about how love was not the dramatic thing, not the first moment or the best moment or the story you told afterward. Love was the margin note. Love was the argument about salt that you had enough times that it became a joke and then became a piece of your shared history, and then became the thing you missed the most, in the end, because it was so small and so completely real. Silas, she said. He looked up from this piece of tack he'd been examining. When I'm old, she said, and someone asks me how I knew, I'm going to say it was the weather stripping. He looked at her. The first week, she said. You fixed the weather stripping I'd done on the door. Redid it properly. You didn't say anything about it. You just fixed it. She looked at the recipe tin. I thought, this man is going to fix things quietly for the rest of his life and never ask to be thanked for it. And I thought that was either going to be very good or very difficult, and I wanted to know which. Which was it? He said. Both, she said, at the same time, constantly. He looked at her for a moment with the expression that was his version of a smile when the smile was too full to stay small. Good, he said. I'd hate to be easy. She put the recipe card back in the tin and closed it carefully, and the lamp burned steady between them, and the stove did its faithful work, and outside the spring dark settled over the valley, and the mountains stood where they always stood, indifferent and enormous, and not caring what small things happened in the light below them. But the small things happened anyway. The cabin settled into the night. The fire held. They moved around each other in the familiar way. She to the bedroom first, he to bank the stove, the old careful step avoiding the loose board, the sound of the stove door, the sounds she'd learned to sleep through and now slept with, the texture of nights in a place that had become, without her entirely deciding it, home. She lay in the dark and listened to him come in, and she thought about October. The trunk, the 3 days, the strange man with his hat in his hands, and she thought about all the distance between that morning and this one, and what it had cost and what it had given back and what the difference was between those two numbers. She'd come into this valley expecting to endure. She'd been so ready to endure. She had built her walls high and her eyes sharp, and her heart closed to anything that might cost more than she wanted to spend. And then a winter had happened to her. A real winter, the kind that doesn't care about your plans. And inside it, something had been made that she couldn't have built in any other conditions. You didn't get Silas Boone by looking for him. You didn't earn that kind of man by deserving him in the abstract. You earned it by showing up in a strange cabin in October and fixing the weather stripping yourself and going to midnight birthings and reorganizing storerooms and arguing about fence lines and sitting up through storms and saying, finally, when it counted, I want you to come in. That's the real reason. And he had come in, and it had been cold and not perfect, and the bed had been too narrow, and they had both been imperfect people trying to do a real thing in difficult circumstances. And that was the whole story, and somehow the whole story was enough, more than enough. She heard him settle into the space beside her, careful in the dark. Good day, he said. Very good day, she said. He reached over in the familiar way, and his hand found hers, and she held it, and the spring dark lay soft over the valley, and the mountains kept their silence. And inside the cabin, the fire held through the night the way it always did. Not because it was magic, not because anything had been promised, but because someone had built it right and kept it fed, which was all any lasting warmth had ever required. In a valley where winter came hard and stayed long and tested everything it touched, two imperfect people had learned the only thing worth learning, that the life you chose was always stronger than the life you were given, that patience was not the same as passivity, and silence was not the same as emptiness, and a person who showed up every day and did the work without asking for credit was not a simple person. They were the rarest kind, and that the truest thing you could say about love was not that it arrived, or that it saved you, or that it made you whole. The truest thing was that it asked you to keep choosing it every morning in the ordinary cold light of an ordinary day, and that the choosing, done honestly over time, was where everything worth having lived.